Hello everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Let's get started. Story 1. The fog pressed in thick and cold, swallowing the world whole. Sarah's headlights barely broke through the dense, swirling mist as she navigated the winding road, barely wide enough for her car. It felt like the world was closing in, the fog hugging the earth, blurring everything just beyond her reach. The kind of fog that made the night seem endless, and the road, twisting and narrow, felt like it was leading nowhere. Her hands gripped the wheel tighter. Just get to the house, she told herself, but even her thoughts felt lost in the haze. There was no reason to be nervous. She was just passing through, looking for a place to rest after a long drive. But something about the road, something about the thick, unnatural quiet, made her second-guess her decision. The house stood out in the distance, its outline barely visible against the fog. As she drew closer, it loomed larger, its shadow stretching toward her like a dark omen. The place looked ancient, sagging as though time itself had forgotten it. The structure leaned slightly to one side, its once white paint now cracked and peeling like aged skin, and the windows, dark hollow eyes, gazed back at her. Something about it sent an uneasy shiver down her spine. She had been driving for hours. The town had been small, almost forgotten, a place she'd passed through without a second thought. She hadn't meant to stop, but the house, the only one she could find near the highway, seemed like it would do. A place to crash for the night. But now, standing before it, Sarah felt a cold sense of wrongness creep into her bones. She parked the car, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. The silence was almost oppressive, a heavy stillness that made her ears ring. No birds, no animals, just the faint rustle of trees in the distance, barely audible. She hesitated, staring at the door, half expecting it to open on its own. It didn't. But the feeling in the air only grew thicker, heavier, as if the house itself were waiting for her. Asterisk, it's just an old place. Nothing to worry about, asterisk, she tried to reassure herself, but the words sounded hollow in the silence. Her hand shook as she reached for the door handle. The cold night air hit her face like a slap when she stepped out. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, but it didn't help against the eerie chill that seemed to come from the house itself. The front door, old and battered, creaked as it swung open as though expecting her. She stepped inside, but the sudden change in temperature made her shiver. The air was thick, musty, and smelled of something forgotten. She paused for a moment, standing in the entryway, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The house was cold, empty, and the silence was unsettling. "Hello?" she called out, but her voice felt swallowed by the house, fading into the distance. There was no answer. Her boots echoed in the hallway as she moved further inside. The floorboards creaked beneath her, and the walls, lined with old portraits, seemed to watch her. Dust clung to everything, the remnants of a life that had long since disappeared. The shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to twist, stretching out like fingers reaching for her. The floor beneath her feet groaned again, louder this time. She paused, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes darting toward the staircase at the far end of the hall. The second-floor landing was barely visible, cloaked in shadows. Something stirred there, but she couldn't see what it was. She tried to calm herself. Asterisk, just the house settling, asterisk, she told herself. But it felt like more than that. The wind outside howled, rattling the old windows, and Sarah jumped, her heart pounding. She hadn't realized how tense she'd been until the sound broke the silence. A soft rustling came from the floor above. It was quiet at first, but then a distinct thud, a footstep, sounded from somewhere just beyond her reach. She froze, her breath shallow in her chest. It had been too distinct to ignore. Someone, or something, was upstairs. "It's just the house settling," she repeated in her mind, but it felt like a lie. She glanced around, her eyes catching on a grandfather clock in the corner of the room, its pendulum still and unmoving. The silence seemed to press in closer, more suffocating. The ticking of the clock should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. Instead, it seemed like a countdown. A slow, inevitable countdown to something she couldn't quite understand. The footsteps from above sounded again. But this time they were closer. "Hello?" she called out again, her voice more uncertain. This time there was no response. Nothing moved. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, that she wasn't alone. She turned toward the staircase. She could leave. She could turn around, walk out, and drive back into the night. But she didn't. Instead, she took one step toward the stairs and then another. The house seemed to groan under her weight as she ascended. Each step felt like it was echoing too loudly, as though the house was absorbing the sound of her every movement. The air grew colder as she climbed. A sudden draft, cold and biting, swept through the hall. And then, without warning, the door at the end of the hallway creaked open. Her heart skipped a beat. No one had been there a moment ago. The hallway was empty, the door closed. But now it stood ajar. The faintest flicker of light from inside spilled into the hall. Sarah stood at the top of the stairs, staring at the door, her breath shallow. A part of her wanted to run, but she couldn't. She had to know. She had to see. With each step she took toward the door, the air grew thicker, heavier, as though the house was wrapping itself around her, drawing her in. And then she saw it. A shadow just beyond the threshold. It was still unmoving. For a long moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. The door slammed shut. The sound was deafening. Her heart pounded in her chest as she staggered backward, nearly losing her footing. She pressed her back against the wall, eyes wide, pulse racing. The house was silent again, but it was different now. The stillness wasn't comforting, it was suffocating, like the calm before a storm. She didn't know what she had seen, if she had seen anything, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that she couldn't leave. She couldn't go back. Not now. Something was here with her. And it wasn't done with her yet. Sarah's breath hitched as she pressed herself against the wall, her heart thudding in her chest. The door at the end of the hall had slammed shut with a force that rattled her bones. She stood there in the thick silence, her fingers trembling, her mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been a gust of wind? No, the air was still, too still, and the door had been solid. No wind could have made it slam like that. Her thoughts twisted, colliding with the shadows that seemed to grow longer in the dim light. What's happening? What is this place? The house, which had already felt unnerving, now seemed like a trap, its walls narrowing, closing in on her with each passing second. She couldn't explain it, but she felt it, a weight in the air that pressed against her chest. She wanted to run. She should run. But she couldn't. Instead, she turned slowly, her eyes flicking around the hallway, seeking something, anything, to explain the noise, the door. The heavy silence was almost unbearable now. There were no sounds of the wind outside, no creaks of the old house settling. It was as if the world had stopped moving, and only she was left, stuck in this oppressive moment. Get it together, Sarah, she swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. She was overthinking it. That's all. The house was old, creaky, and had probably just settled. But the tightness in her chest wouldn't go away, and neither would the icy sensation creeping over her skin. She needed to move, to do something to break the tension. Taking a hesitant step forward, she forced her legs to carry her back down the hall toward the staircase. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight, and her footsteps echoed too loudly in the oppressive stillness. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, staring back at the hallway, unsure of where to go next. The door was still shut. Whatever had been behind it, if anything, was gone. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. She could feel it, like a presence just out of sight, lingering in the corners of her vision. She turned away from the staircase, choosing to explore the rest of the ground floor. Anything to keep moving, anything to make her feel less trapped. There was a doorway to her left, leading into a room that appeared to be a sitting room. A faded armchair sat in the middle, surrounded by dust-covered furniture. A few old, crooked portraits hung on the walls, their eyes seeming to follow her every movement. The room felt like it hadn't been touched in decades, abandoned, forgotten. She moved into the room, eyes scanning every corner, every surface. The air was thick with dust, the furniture heavy and imposing. A fireplace sat along the far wall, its stone hearth cold and empty. As she walked toward it, her shoes tapping softly against the floor, she noticed something strange, a small object sitting on the mantel. It was a photograph, yellowed with age, the edges curling as if it had been there for far too long. Sarah stepped closer, picking it up with trembling fingers. The photo was blurry, but it was unmistakably old. The image was of a family standing in front of a house. The house, her heart skipped. It was the very same house. But the people, who were they? There was a man, tall and gaunt, his face shadowed in the photograph. A woman stood beside him, her expression vacant, as though she were staring at something just beyond the frame. And there was a child, a little girl, standing in front of them, her face half hidden by the shadow of the man. She couldn't have been older than 8, but her eyes, those eyes, they were too knowing, too empty. Sarah's fingers gripped the photograph tighter, her pulse quickening as a strange, cold shiver passed through her. Something about the faces in the photo unsettled her deeply, like they knew her in some way. But that was impossible, wasn't it? She turned it over, hoping for some clue, some explanation, but the back was blank. No names, no date. Just an empty, forgotten picture. Something caught her eye as she studied the photo, a movement in the corner of the room. She stiffened, her heart hammering in her chest. But when she looked, there was nothing there. Just the shadows. Just the empty room. The sound of something heavy shifting upstairs broke her focus. The floor creaked under the weight of slow, deliberate footsteps. Too heavy to be the wind, too purposeful to be the house settling. Someone was up there. She had to know what it was. But the thought of going up there, into the darkness, into the unknown, made her hesitate. Her legs felt like lead, and her breath was shallow, every instinct screaming at her to run, to leave. But she couldn't. Instead, she turned and walked toward the staircase, each step feeling like an eternity. The creaks of the house beneath her feet seemed to grow louder, as though it were alive, watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. At the bottom of the stairs, Sarah paused, staring up into the darkness. The footsteps had stopped. The house was still once more, and yet the air felt charged with something, a sense of expectation. She reached for the banister, its wood cold under her touch. Then, slowly she began to climb. The air grew colder as she ascended, a chill seeping into her bones. She tried to steady her breathing, but her pulse was racing, her heart in her throat. Each step creaked louder than the last, and when she reached the landing, she felt the weight of the house pressing down on her. The hallway stretched before her, shadows flickering and dancing at the edges of her vision. The door at the end of the hall was still shut. It had been when she first arrived, and it was now. But the air felt different, thicker, charged with something unnatural. A soft sound, a whisper, a murmur, came from behind the door. It was so faint, so indistinct, that for a moment, Sarah thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But then it came again. Sarah? Her name, spoken in a voice that was not her own, sent a jolt of cold fear through her. She had no choice. She had to open the door. The door was still shut. It had been moments before, but now, with her hand gripping the cold brass handle, it felt as if hours had passed. The faint whisper, the voice calling her name, had stopped. But the eerie silence that followed felt even worse. Her heart was thudding in her chest, and her mind was spiraling in a dozen directions at once. Was it a figment of her imagination? Was it just the house settling again? But no, it wasn't the creak of wood or the hum of wind. It had been a voice. Soft, coaxing, like someone who knew her. Someone who was expecting her. Sarah swallowed hard and slowly turned the handle, the sound of it scraping against the wood echoing down the empty hallway like a distant scream. For a moment, she stood frozen, just on the threshold, her breath shallow and ragged. The darkness inside the room stretched before her, thick and oppressive, as though the very air in there was heavier than anywhere else in the house. Then, almost against her will, she stepped inside. The room was cold. So cold it made her teeth ache. The walls, once a bright and inviting cream, had long since faded to a grimy yellow, their once rich texture peeling away in places like old, decaying skin. The floor was a dark, polished wood, and in the far corner, a large window was partially open, though no wind blew through it. The curtains hung motionless, their pale fabric lifeless against the stillness of the room. But it wasn't the room itself that unsettled her. It was what was in it. The space seemed cluttered with odd remnants of another time, old furniture long abandoned, now shrouded in dust. A pair of moth-eaten armchairs sat near the window, their upholstery torn and faded. A rug, once grand but now threadbare, lay haphazardly on the floor, the edges curling up like the corners of an old, forgotten letter. Bookshelves lined the far wall, their contents buried under layers of dust, their titles unreadable. And then there was the mirror. It was large, occupying the space above the fireplace, its frame dark wood carved with intricate patterns, worn smooth by time. At first, Sarah didn't notice it. It was only when her eyes were drawn to it that the chill in her spine deepened. There was something about the way the mirror seemed to absorb the light, its surface too dark, too reflective. She stepped closer, her movements slow, deliberate. As her reflection appeared, distorted in the glass, she flinched. There was something off about it. Her own face seemed unfamiliar, twisted slightly as if the reflection was unwilling to show her in the way she saw herself. Her features were sharp, her eyes darkened with exhaustion and fear, and her hair, strangely, looked longer, darker than it had been moments before. She blinked, rubbing her eyes, convinced it was just the dim light. But when she opened them again, the reflection was unchanged. No, not unchanged. Something was moving in the reflection. Her heart leaped in her chest as she realized that the figure standing beside her wasn't her own. It was a woman, pale, gaunt, and dressed in a long, tattered nightgown. She stood motionless, her face obscured by the shadows of the room, yet her presence was undeniable. And then, the figure's head slowly tilted towards Sarah, her empty eyes gleaming from the darkened reflection. The blood drained from Sarah's face as she took a staggered step back. She could feel her pulse pounding in her throat, her chest tightening with panic. The woman in the mirror smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was twisted, as though the woman had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Sarah to step into this room and finally see her. Sarah stumbled backward, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. She had to get out of the room, away from the mirror, away from that woman. She had to. The door slammed shut behind her. She whipped around, her heart racing, but no one was there. The room was still empty, save for the eerie remnants of time and the lingering presence of something watching her. The mirror, though, the mirror asterisk, it was reflecting the room as it had been before. No pale woman. No figure standing beside her. Just the cold, empty room. But she knew. She knew what she had seen. She backed away from the mirror slowly, her mind screaming at her to leave, to get out of the house, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. She was frozen, trapped in the grip of terror, her hands trembling uncontrollably. And then, as she reached the door, a soft sound broke the silence. A whisper. Her name. Sarah? It was the same voice as before. But this time it didn't come from the mirror. It came from behind her. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the voice, only to find nothing. The room was empty, empty and still. And then she saw it. On the wall near the door was a strange symbol. It was faint, almost as if it had been scratched into the wood over years of neglect. It was the same symbol she had seen in the photograph, the one from the portrait of the family. A twisted, looping design that seemed to move, shifting in her peripheral vision like something alive. She reached out toward it, her fingers brushing the wood. As she touched the symbol, a sudden rush of cold swept through her, and the air in the room seemed to constrict, tightening around her chest. The whisper came again, louder now. Leave, now, Sarah's breath hitched in her throat as her gaze snapped toward the door. Something was wrong. The symbol, it wasn't just a symbol. It was a warning. And she had been marked. Without another thought, she spun toward the door, yanking it open and fleeing from the room. She didn't look back as she ran down the hall, the echo of her own footsteps chasing her like a shadow. But she couldn't escape the feeling, the sensation of something just behind her, waiting, watching. She was never alone here. Sarah's pulse hadn't slowed since she'd left the mirror behind, but the house didn't seem to want to let her go. Each step down the dimly lit hallway felt like it took an eternity. The air was thick with something she couldn't name, something heavy pressing in on her chest with each breath. She had to get out. Had to leave this place, this horrible place where nothing felt real. Her legs carried her to the stairs, her feet stumbling on the uneven boards. The house groaned and shifted around her, and though she couldn't see anything, she felt the presence of something, someone, following her. The whispers were still there, echoing in her mind, tugging at her sanity like a string. But there was no one behind her. She spun around again, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The hallway was empty, and yet the sensation of being watched, of being stalked, only deepened. Her fingers brushed the banister as she made her way down, nearly tripping when she reached the bottom step. The cold air was like ice against her skin, and she pulled her jacket tighter, shivering despite the warmth of the house. The living room, which had once seemed a safe haven, was now just as oppressive as the rest of the house. The furniture was covered in layers of dust, the windows dark with the weight of the approaching night. She hesitated at the doorway, torn between wanting to explore further and the instinct to leave, to run until she was far away from here. But there was something nagging at her, something she had to find. The photograph, the family, the woman in the mirror. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was a connection, something she hadn't uncovered yet, something she needed to know before she could leave this place in peace. But what? What was she supposed to be looking for? A soft creak interrupted her thoughts. She turned quickly, her heart leaping in her chest. There was a door, one she hadn't noticed before. It was tucked in the far corner of the room, barely visible in the shadows, hidden behind the long, heavy curtains that draped the walls. She had been so focused on escaping that she hadn't paid attention to it. But now, as if it were waiting for her, the door seemed to beckon. The wood was old, its edges warped and weathered. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years, decades maybe. She couldn't resist. Her hand reached for the knob, which was cold to the touch, sending a jolt of unease through her. The door creaked open with an eerie slowness, the sound filling the room like a cry of the damned. What she saw inside was nothing like the rest of the house. It wasn't empty or decaying. It wasn't even just another room. It was a forgotten space, a room frozen in time. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were dozens of old, dusty books. But it wasn't the books that made her breath catch in her throat. It was the table in the center of the room where someone, had been waiting for her. Atop the table lay a collection of strange, unfamiliar objects. Old candles, a cracked porcelain doll, piles of faded photographs, and a black, leather-bound book. Its cover was embossed with the same strange symbol she had seen earlier, the one from the wall in the mirror room. The symbol seemed to writhe on the cover as if it were alive, shifting under her gaze. Sarah stepped inside, unable to stop herself, her feet carrying her forward as if drawn by an invisible force. She reached for the book, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. The moment she touched it, a cold shiver ran up her spine, and the room seemed to grow darker. Suddenly she heard it again. The whisper. Sarah? Her name was spoken softly, but there was something behind it now. A threat, a warning, as if the very walls were breathing her name, and the house itself was closing in around her. She snapped the book open, her eyes scanning the pages, and her breath caught in her throat. The pages were filled with strange writing, symbols she couldn't understand. But scattered throughout the text were pictures, drawings, sketched in crude ink. The same woman from the mirror, the pale figure was in each one. She was drawn in various poses, standing alone in the shadows, reaching out toward the viewer, and always with that same twisted smile. And the thing that made Sarah's stomach churn, that made her drop the book as if it had burned her, her face star. In every picture, the woman's face was partially obscured, but beneath the inked lines, Sarah could see her own features reflected in the drawings. It was as if she had been there before, as if her presence had always been expected. A scream bubbled up in Sarah's throat, but she choked it down. She had to focus. There was something else about the room. She turned, her eyes sweeping the dark corners, and there, in the farthest corner of the room, she saw something move. It was brief, just a shadow, but it was enough to send a cold terror through her veins. She stepped backward, the sound of her heart hammering in her chest louder than anything else in the room. And then, the door slammed shut star. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the shadows thickening, and the air grew impossibly cold. It was as if the house itself had become a living, breathing thing, and it was growing angry. Leave? The whisper came again, but this time it was not a voice. It was a command. Sarah's breath hitched. Her legs felt like lead as she backed toward the door, the air thick with the sensation of being trapped. But it wasn't the door she needed to leave through. Something was waiting for her outside. Something that wanted her to stay. The whisper grew louder, closer, until it wasn't a whisper at all. It was a scream. Leave now, With all the strength she had left, Sarah yanked open the door, stumbling into the hallway. The house seemed to breathe around her, and for the briefest moment she thought she could hear the sound of footsteps, chasing her star. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. Only the silence, and the house, watching her. The door to the forgotten room had slammed behind her with such force that it rattled the house to its very core. The suddenness of it left Sarah breathless, her mind struggling to make sense of what she had just witnessed. That book, the woman's face, the chilling whisper, it was all too much. She stumbled down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest, feeling the oppressive weight of the house closing in on her from all sides. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and every step she took seemed to echo through the empty spaces like a drumbeat, announcing her presence to something else, something watching her. She had to get out. This place was wrong. She had known that from the moment she stepped inside, but it was only now, after uncovering the first of the house's many secrets, that the truth was truly sinking in. It wasn't just haunted. It was something worse. But where could she go? The house was so large, so labyrinthine, its halls twisting and turning in ways that made it feel like a living, breathing maze. The exit seemed miles away, and she wasn't even sure she could find it. Her feet carried her down the hallway, and as she passed the staircase, she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye. Something different. A door. Another door. It was small, tucked into the wall near the back of the house, half hidden behind an old, moth-eaten rug. It wasn't the same kind of door as the others. This one had a cold, almost deliberate quality to it. The dark wood was cracked, as though it hadn't been opened in ages. But there was something about it, something in the back of her mind telling her to open it. She paused for a long moment, staring at the door, her heart racing as the urge to explore gnawed at her. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and leave, but her curiosity, the same damnable curiosity that had brought her into the house in the first place, pushed her forward. With trembling hands, she reached for the doorknob. It was cold. Colder than it should have been, colder than the rest of the house. A deep breath and she turned it. The door creaked open with a sound so loud, it felt like it echoed across the entire house. She stepped inside, feeling the air shift around her, growing colder still. The room beyond was pitch black, darker than the rest of the house, with a damp, musty smell that made her stomach churn. Then she saw it. The narrow staircase that spiraled downward, disappearing into the depths of the house. Her breath caught in her throat. The basement. She hadn't seen this on the floor plan, and there was no mention of it when she had researched the house. The air down there felt thick with something heavy, something ancient. She didn't want to go down there, but she knew she had no choice. She had come this far, and if she was ever going to understand what was happening here, she had to face whatever lay beneath. Taking one last look at the hallway behind her, Sarah stepped onto the first step. The stairs creaked beneath her weight, their groans resonating deep in her bones. Each step took her deeper into the earth, further away from the world she knew, until the light from above barely reached her. The stairs seemed endless, the oppressive air weighing on her chest, making it hard to breathe. But she kept moving, each step feeling like a countdown towards something inevitable. She couldn't turn back now. The faint sound of dripping water echoed through the darkness, and she swallowed hard. What could be down here? What had been hidden for so long? Her feet finally touched solid ground, and she stepped off the last stair into the cold, damp basement. The air was thick, almost suffocating, with the smell of mildew and decay. The faint flicker of a light bulb above her cast erratic shadows on the cracked stone walls, giving the space an otherworldly feel. She stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light, taking in her surroundings. The basement was larger than she expected, and the walls were lined with shelves, some of them still filled with old, dusty boxes. But it was what lay in the center of the room that caught her attention. A large wooden chest. It was old, its surface scratched and scarred from years of neglect. The metal clasps were rusted, and the wood looked as if it might collapse at any moment. But there was something about it, something about the way it seemed to pulse with a presence that she couldn't ignore. It was almost as if it were alive. Sarah's pulse quickened. She knew what she had to do. With shaking hands, she approached the chest, her feet barely making a sound on the cold concrete floor. She reached for the metal clasps, her fingers trembling as she pried them open. The chest creaked as if it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her. And then, with a final echoing groan, the chest opened. Inside there were old papers, bundles of faded cloth, and something else. At the very bottom of the chest lay a small, weathered book. Unlike the other objects in the chest, this one was clean, its cover smooth and unmarked. But as Sarah reached for it, a chill ran down her spine. The book felt wrong, *unnatural star. She picked it up, and as soon as her fingers touched the cover, a sharp, piercing noise filled her ears. It was like the sound of 1,000 whispers, rising in intensity until it felt like it was coming from inside her skull. The whispers were maddening, as if the house itself was trying to reach out to her, to drag her into its depths. Sarah? The voice was low and guttural, and it seemed to come from all around her. She couldn't tell if it was real, if it was the house, or if it was her mind playing tricks on her. But the moment the voice spoke her name, everything went still. The room grew colder, and Sarah felt the walls closing in. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, moving closer, as if something was waiting, waiting for her to understand star. She opened the book. The pages were filled with strange symbols, much like those in the book from the room upstairs. The symbols weren't just drawings. They shifted, moved on the page as if they were alive. And then, as her eyes traced over the pages, Sarah froze. There, in the back of the book, was a picture. It was a picture of her, exactly like the drawing from the other book. Her stomach lurched. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But the book had no answers, no explanations. It only left her with more questions. And as she turned to leave the basement, she knew *** was still there, watching her, waiting. The basement door slammed shut behind her with a force that rattled the walls. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she fumbled for the doorknob, her breath coming in sharp, frantic gasps. The coldness in the air had followed her from the basement, settling deep within her bones. She didn't know what she'd expected when she opened that chest, but it wasn't this. Not the feeling of being watched, of being pulled into something she couldn't understand. Something that wanted her there, wanted her to stay. She stumbled up the stairs, the book clutched tightly in her hands. The pages seemed to hum, vibrating slightly as if the words themselves were alive, desperate to tell her something. But every time she tried to look at them, her mind grew foggy, the symbols blurring before her eyes. She slammed the basement door shut, the noise echoing through the house. As if on cue, the house seemed to groan in response, the walls settling with a deep, mournful sigh. She didn't have time to dwell on it. There were too many questions, too many strange occurrences piling on top of each other, until they felt like a suffocating weight. She had to get out. She had to leave this place. But as she turned to face the hallway, she froze. The mirrors. There were mirrors everywhere. They lined the walls like sentinels, stretching from floor to ceiling. Old, ornate frames, some cracked, some faded with age, but all of them reflecting the dim light in strange, distorted ways. For a brief moment, Sarah felt a strange compulsion to look into them, as if something else was there, something waiting. Her legs felt like lead, but her feet carried her forward as if drawn by an invisible force. She passed the first few mirrors, their glass darkened by dust, but then, something caught her eye. The mirror at the end of the hall, the largest one, the one she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't dusty. It was pristine, its surface clear and polished as if someone had just cleaned it. And in it she saw something she couldn't explain. Herself. But not exactly. The reflection of Sarah in the mirror was wrong, distorted in a way that made her stomach churn. The shadows around her seemed deeper, darker. Her face was pale, almost sickly, and her eyes, they were wide, too wide. The pupils were pinpricks of black, and the skin around her eyes looked stretched, unnatural. For a moment, Sarah thought she might pass out. Her hand went to her throat as if to steady herself, but then something caught her attention. There, behind her reflection, standing just out of view, was another figure. A woman. She was barely visible, like a faint outline, her form shifting in and out of focus, as though the glass itself were warping. Sarah's breath hitched as the woman's face became clearer. She was pale, her long dark hair hanging limp around her face, but her eyes were the worst part. They were hollow, empty, black as the void. Sarah wanted to look away, but her body wouldn't obey. She couldn't tear her eyes from the mirror. The woman in the reflection was watching her, and Sarah could feel it, a cold, suffocating presence that made her skin crawl. The woman didn't move, didn't blink. She just stared, her empty gaze fixed on Sarah with an unsettling intensity. And then her lips moved. At first, Sarah couldn't hear anything, just a faint buzzing sound, like a voice buried beneath layers of static. But then the words became clearer, low and rasping, the woman's voice like dry leaves in a windstorm. You shouldn't have come, *. The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut, the breath leaving her lungs in a sudden rush. She staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the scream that clawed its way up her throat. The woman's lips curled into a smile, slow, deliberate, as if savoring the terror that she had caused. Sarah's heart was racing now, her pulse thudding in her ears. She wanted to run, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The house was alive again, its walls pulsing with a life of their own, pressing in on her from all sides. The woman's smile grew wider, her face warping further, stretching unnaturally as if she were being drawn into the very fabric of the mirror. Then, with a sudden jolt, the reflection of the woman blinked. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The woman's eyes, which had been hollow moments ago, now glinted with something darker, something alive. It was as if the mirror had become a portal, a window into something else, something that shouldn't exist. The woman's figure began to move, her body shifting unnaturally, like a marionette being pulled on invisible strings. Slowly, she reached out toward Sarah, her bony fingers stretching through the glass as though it were made of water, her hand moving toward her throat. "No!" Sarah screamed, breaking the trance. She lurched backward, slamming into the wall behind her as she gasped for air. Her chest tightened, the weight of her fear suffocating her. But when she looked back at the mirror, the woman was gone. The reflection was normal again, her own face staring back at her, wide-eyed and pale, her chest rising and falling with frantic breaths. The house was silent now, as if nothing had ever happened, as if the woman had never been there at all. Sarah wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't explain what had just happened. Had it been real, or was it just another trick of the house? Another trick of her mind, worn thin by fear and the isolation of this damnable place? But deep down she knew the truth. It wasn't just the house that was haunting her. It was something else. Something that had been waiting. And now it was coming for her. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the silence in the house more oppressive than ever before. The air grew colder as Sarah stood in the hallway, her hand still trembling from her encounter with the mirror. The faintest breeze whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it a chill that sank deep into her bones. Her mind raced, the image of the woman in the reflection haunting her every thought. She couldn't stay here. Not another minute. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, every gust of wind that rattled the windows felt like a warning. She wasn't alone. Something was in the house with her, something old, something malevolent, something that had been waiting for her. But the door. She had to get out of the house, but the door, the front door, was locked. It had been locked the entire time she had been there, and now, standing at the top of the stairs, she felt it mocking her. As if the house itself were keeping her inside, holding her hostage. Taking a deep breath, Sarah forced her legs to move. Her every step felt weighted, as if something was trying to pull her back into the darkness that lurked around every corner. She moved through the hall toward the living room, where she had first seen the strange markings on the walls, the symbols that seemed to whisper in a language she couldn't understand. The thought of the symbols made her stomach churn. She had to know what they meant. She had to find out. The air grew thicker as she crossed the room, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. The fireplace, once roaring with life, was now cold and empty, its ashes long dead. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but the books were old and covered in a thick layer of dust, their spines cracked and yellowed with age. She reached out to run her fingers along one of the shelves, but stopped short. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, the feeling of being watched pressing on her chest. She wasn't alone. Her eyes darted to the far side of the room, where the walls seemed to ripple, as if they were breathing, shifting in and out of focus. There, in the corner near the faded curtains, something moved. It was quick, just a flicker at the edge of her vision. Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. She told herself it was nothing, just the house settling, just the wind, But then the whispering started. It was soft at first, barely audible, a faint rustling sound that seemed to come from behind the walls. But as the seconds passed, it grew louder. Sarah's pulse quickened as the whispers turned into words, low and guttural, speaking in a language she couldn't recognize. The words felt wrong, like they were being spoken from the depths of the earth, from a place too old for her to understand. Her heart hammered in her chest, her legs shaking as she turned to look around the room, searching for the source of the noise. There was no one there. But the whispers continued, coming from all directions, swirling around her like a storm. Sarah backed away from the wall, her mind racing. She had to find a way out. She had to leave this place. But the whispers wouldn't stop. They were inside her head now, invading her thoughts, planting seeds of doubt and fear that grew with every passing moment. They were all around her, seeping into her mind, driving her mad. Sarah? The whisper came again, this time clear, as though someone had spoken her name from the shadows. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror, but there was no one there. No one, except for the shadows that seemed to stretch and shift in the corners of the room. Sarah? The voice came again, louder this time, almost a hiss. It was coming from behind her, from the walls themselves. The whisper was a call, a beckoning like a siren's song drawing her closer to the abyss. She stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps as she backed away from the wall, trying to distance herself from the voices that clawed at her mind. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the whispering stopped. Silence. The sudden stillness was suffocating, the kind of silence that presses in on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. It felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears as she stood there, frozen in the middle of the room. And then, just when she thought she could breathe again, she heard something else. A footstep. Slow. Deliberate. Heavy. It was coming from behind her, from the hallway. Sarah's stomach dropped. She couldn't see anyone, couldn't hear any other sound except for the distant, muffled footfalls, getting closer and closer with every second. She turned quickly, her eyes darting toward the hallway, but all she could see was the shadow of the doorway. There was no one there. The footstep came again. Closer. Each one heavier than the last. It was as if someone, or something, was walking toward her, its presence growing more tangible with each passing second. She turned back toward the front door, but it was still locked. She could feel the weight of it, as if it were mocking her, reminding her that she was trapped. There was nowhere to run. No way to escape. No one is coming. The words echoed in her mind, a cold truth that sent a chill down her spine. The footsteps sounded again, closer now. Right behind her. She could feel the air growing colder, the hairs on her neck standing on end. Without thinking, Sarah bolted toward the stairs. She didn't care where she was going, just that she had to get away. She had to get away from whatever was in the house with her. As she ran up the stairs, the footsteps followed, quickening, gaining on her. But when she reached the top, when she turned to look over her shoulder, there was no one there. Nothing. The house was silent again. But the whispers lingered. The air inside the house felt heavier now. It clung to Sarah's skin, making it hard to breathe, like a thick fog that refused to let go. The stairs creaked under her feet as she retreated down the hallway, glancing nervously over her shoulder at every sound. Her mind raced, trying to process what had happened. The whispers, the footsteps that followed her, the sensation of being watched from every corner. Get out, she thought desperately. But every step she took seemed to lead her deeper into the house, into its suffocating embrace. She passed by the door to the kitchen, its wooden frame cracked and weathered by time. The dim light from the hallway barely reached inside, casting long shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. Her stomach churned and she fought the urge to turn back. There was no safe place here. Not anymore. But she couldn't stop. She needed answers. She needed to understand what was happening, why the house felt alive, why it wanted her here. As Sarah moved toward the back of the house, she noticed something strange, something new. The walls were changing. At first it was subtle. Small cracks appeared along the surface of the plaster, jagged lines that twisted and turned, as though the walls themselves were alive, stretching, pulling at the house. Then, as Sarah's gaze fixed on the cracks, they began to widen, revealing faces. She froze, her heart nearly stopping as she stared at the first one. It was barely more than a shadow, a faint outline of a face trapped within the wall, but its eyes were wide open, staring directly at her. The face was a woman with hollow cheeks and an expression twisted in eternal horror. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, full of desperation. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, the blood draining from her face as she looked at the other cracks along the wall. More faces emerged, some with their eyes shut tight, others gazing at her with a mixture of sorrow, fear, and something darker. Faces of men, women, and children, all trapped in the plaster, their features twisted, distorted by the shifting walls. The house was feeding on them. She stumbled backward, her mind reeling. She had heard stories of haunted places, but this was something else. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for her, waiting for someone to break its silence, to awaken it from its long slumber. The faces didn't move, but Sarah could feel their gaze, could feel their eyes following her every movement, their presence pressing in on her, suffocating her with their unspoken terror. I need to leave, she thought again, but the walls seemed to close in on her, the hallway narrowing with every step. The house was shifting, twisting around her, guiding her toward the room at the end of the hall. The room she hadn't dared enter before. It was the master bedroom. She had avoided it instinctively, as if the house itself had warned her to stay away. But now, as the air grew colder and the walls seemed to press in on her, there was no other choice. She couldn't turn back, not anymore. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. The cold metal sent a jolt of electricity through her, a shock that made her whole body tense. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing, but her heart raced in her chest, pounding against her ribcage as if it wanted to escape. With a deep breath, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the pale moon filtering through the dust-covered windows. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and old wood. The room was frozen in time, like a museum of decay, every piece of furniture covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. The bed was a massive four-poster, its canopy draped in tattered curtains that fluttered faintly in the draft. At first, Sarah didn't see it. The presence that had been pulling her here, the force that had been guiding her to this room. It was subtle, too subtle to notice at first. But then, just as her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw it. The mirror. It was large, ornate, and framed in dark wood, its surface cracked and tarnished by time. It stood against the far wall, reflecting nothing but darkness, an empty, hollow reflection that felt more like a void than a mirror. And in that void, something stirred. Something watched her. She stepped closer, drawn in by a force she couldn't explain. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she moved toward the mirror, her own reflection barely visible in the murky glass. And then, as she stood there, staring into it, she saw a movement. A shadow, not her own, flitted across the reflection. No, she jerked away, her heart slamming against her ribs. The reflection was wrong, it wasn't her own, it wasn't real. She looked again, this time more carefully, and saw a figure standing in the corner of the room, just beyond the mirror's edge. The figure was watching her. But when she looked away, when she turned to scan the rest of the room, there was no one there. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts as she stepped back, her mind racing. Was it real? Was she losing her grip on reality? And then, in the corner of her vision, she saw it. The face. The face in the mirror. It wasn't the same face as before. It was different. A man's face. The eyes were wide, and his mouth hung open in a silent scream, frozen in time. The reflection moved, the figure in the glass twisting its body, its limbs contorting in impossible ways. Sarah screamed, stumbling backward as the reflection in the mirror seemed to come alive. The face in the glass grinned at her, its expression twisted in mockery. The grin grew wider, stretching unnaturally across its face as it reached out to her from the other side. She had to get out. She had to leave. But the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the room with the mirror, with the thing that lurked within it. The air in the room was suffocating, thick with an unseen weight that pressed down on Sarah's chest. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her mind was racing, consumed by the image of that twisted reflection in the mirror. The thing, whatever it was, had been watching her, its grin spreading wider, pulling her deeper into its grasp. This can't be real, she thought desperately. It can't be. But the cold, clammy sweat on her skin, the tremor in her hands, the oppressive silence, it was all too real. Her heart pounded in her ears, so loud it drowned out everything else, and the room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in. Get out, she thought, her feet frozen to the spot. But how? The door was shut. Locked, she realized, though she couldn't remember locking it. There's no way out. She glanced back at the mirror, her breath hitching in her throat. The face, the twisted, contorted face, was still there. But now it had changed. It was no longer just a reflection. It was alive, its features shifting, warping as it twisted its mouth into a grotesque smile. The eyes followed her every movement, those hollow, dark pits of nothingness that seemed to pierce straight into her soul. It knows me, she realized with a shiver. It knows everything about me. The mirror seemed to pulse, a dark energy rippling through its surface like a disturbance in water. And then, as if responding to her thoughts, the voice came. Soft at first. A whisper. A breath against her ear. Sarah? Her blood ran cold, her body rigid with fear as she spun around, looking for the source of the voice. There was no one. Only the silence of the room, broken only by the distant sound of her own rapid breathing. Sarah? The whisper came again, this time clearer, more distinct. The voice was not her own. It was something else, something familiar, yet twisted. A memory. A feeling. Something from her past she couldn't quite place. Who's there? She whispered, her voice shaking. The walls seemed to close in, and her heart raced faster, thudding against her ribs. It's here. It's in the house with me, And then, as if to answer her, the whispers came again, louder, swirling around her like a storm. Sarah, it's always been here. She gasped, her eyes darting to the mirror again, but the face was gone now. Instead, the glass shimmered, rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. Something was inside the mirror, something that was trying to reach her. Her pulse quickened, and panic surged through her like wildfire. She stumbled backward, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the room. But the door, the door was still locked, Her mind raced. There had to be a way out. She had to get out. And then, as if the house was playing with her, the whispers grew louder. Do you remember? It hissed. Do you remember what you did? She froze. A cold sweat trickled down her spine, and her body trembled as a flood of memories rushed to the surface. Memories she had long buried, locked away in the darkest corners of her mind. Faces. Names. Things she tried so hard to forget. Stop, she whispered, shaking her head. No, I didn't do anything. But the whispers were relentless, circling around her, tearing through her fragile resolve. Yes, you did. You forgot, but it remembers. Sarah clutched her head, her fingers pressing into her temples as though trying to block out the voices. But they were everywhere now, swirling around her, drowning out her thoughts. It's not real, she thought, desperately trying to calm herself. It's just the house. It's just the house playing tricks on me. But the truth was creeping in, like a shadow that crept closer with every breath. The house wasn't just playing tricks. It was alive. It was feeding on her fear, pulling at the deepest parts of her mind, dragging her toward the truth she had tried to forget. She stumbled toward the door again, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. Please, she thought. Please let me out. With a deep breath, she turned it. Click. It was open. A wave of relief washed over her, but it was fleeting, almost mocking. The house wanted her to think she had escaped, but she knew better now. There was no escape. Not really. She stepped out into the hallway, the cold air hitting her skin, but it didn't help. The house was still there, its presence like a weight pressing down on her chest. The walls seemed to stretch and shift, the floors creaking beneath her feet. The whispers followed her, growing louder, swirling around her like a storm that she couldn't escape. The walls seemed to hum with a low, guttural sound, as if the house itself was alive, breathing. She stumbled down the hallway, her eyes darting to every shadow, every corner, every dark space that seemed to stretch toward her. The door at the end of the hall loomed before her, the door that led to the basement. She hesitated, her breath quickening as she stared at it. The basement. She had avoided it until now instinctively. But she knew deep down that there was no avoiding it anymore. The house was leading her there. She stepped forward, her heart hammering in her chest, the whispers growing louder as she reached for the handle. No turning back now. The door creaked open and she stepped inside. The air was colder here, the darkness deeper. The faint smell of rot clung to the air, and the floor beneath her feet felt soft, as though it was giving way to something buried deep below. And then she heard it. A faint sound, like a shuffling, coming from the far corner of the room. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't alone. The whispers stopped. And then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. The figure in the darkness was moving, its shape slowly emerging from the shadows like something not quite human. The room felt colder, the air thicker with each breath she took. Every instinct in her body screamed for her to run, but her legs refused to move. She was frozen, her eyes locked on the silhouette that was now taking form, step by slow step. The figure was tall, too tall, and its limbs stretched unnaturally as if they didn't belong. At first, it looked like a man, but there was something about it that made her skin crawl, something wrong about the way it moved. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, like a puppet on broken strings, and its feet barely seemed to touch the ground as it glided forward. A chill ran down Sarah's spine, and she fought the overwhelming urge to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there and wait for whatever it was to come closer. It's not real, she thought, gripping the edges of her shirt. Asterisk, it's just a trick. A shadow asterisk. But the closer it got, the more real it felt. The eyes, if you could call them eyes, were dark pits, empty and hollow, staring straight through her as if they could see the deepest, darkest parts of her soul. The longer she stared, the more she felt herself sinking into those voids, as if they were pulling her in, dragging her toward something far worse than death itself. Her mouth went dry and her pulse quickened. She tried to take a step back, but her feet wouldn't obey. Her body was paralyzed, trapped in place as the figure came closer, closer, until she could almost feel its cold presence brushing against her. And then it spoke. Its voice was low, a rasping, guttural whisper that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. It wasn't a voice that belonged to a person. It was ancient, filled with malice and hunger. "Sarah?" The thing rasped, its mouth barely moving. "You remember me now, don't you?" She shook her head, the words choking in her throat. Her vision blurred as the room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing against her until she could hardly breathe. Her legs finally moved, but it was too late. The thing was right there, inches from her, its cold breath like a sickly wind on her face. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, I don't remember you." It tilted its head further, and she could hear a faint cracking noise, as though its neck was not meant to bend that way. The smell of rot and decay grew stronger, filling her nostrils and making her stomach churn. It was so close now that she could feel the weight of its presence bearing down on her. "You do," it croaked. "You've always known. You just forgot." The darkness in the room seemed to grow, folding around her like a living thing, and the thing in front of her grinned, a hideous, gaping grin that stretched impossibly wide, too wide for a human mouth. The grin spread, revealing teeth that were long and jagged, sharp like shards of broken glass. She couldn't look away, couldn't tear her eyes from the thing that was somehow both a part of the room and not a part of it, a creature that had no right to exist in this world. "Why are you here?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" It leaned closer, its cold breath caressing her face as it answered in that same rasping voice. "I've been waiting. Waiting for you to remember. Waiting for you to come back." Back? The word echoed in her mind, and the fog of fear began to lift, just a little. She tried to think, tried to piece together the fragments of her memory that were slipping away like sand through her fingers. She gasped, her heart racing. "What are you talking about?" The thing's grin deepened, its eyes narrowing. "You've always been a part of this place, Sarah. Don't you see? You're not here by accident. You belong here." Suddenly, the room around her seemed to shift, as though the very walls were alive. The shadows writhed, the floor creaked, and the air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on her from all sides. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing in her ears, swirling around her like a swarm of insects. Now she thought, asterisk, I don't belong here. I can't asterisk. But the figure was relentless, its dark gaze boring into her, its voice now a low growl. You do belong here, Sarah. You always have. This house, this place, it's yours. The words hit her like a punch to the gut, and for a moment she felt herself dizzy, lightheaded. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her past, everything she tried to forget, was flooding back, crashing through her like a tidal wave. She gasped, her eyes wide with realization. I remember. But before she could say more, the thing reached out with one long, twisted hand. Its fingers curled around her arm with terrifying strength, pulling her forward. The grip was ice cold, and Sarah could feel her skin freezing where it touched her. You can't escape it, Sarah, the thing whispered, its voice full of triumph. You've already made your choice. The world seemed to spin, and for a moment she thought she might faint. She couldn't escape. There was nowhere to run. The shadows were closing in around her, and she was trapped in this nightmare. But then something inside her snapped. With a burst of strength she didn't know she had, she wrenched herself free from the creature's grasp, stumbling backward. She didn't know how, but she forced herself to run. Her feet pounded against the floor as she sprinted toward the stairs, the shadows twisting in her wake, the whispers chasing her, hissing and cackling like 1,000 voices in the dark. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. But the sound of the thing's low laughter followed her, growing louder, closer, until it felt like the very walls were laughing with it. The staircase seemed to stretch forever, each step like a weight dragging her down into the abyss. She reached the top, her heart pounding in her chest, but she knew the thing was still there, still waiting. And then she heard it. A soft, familiar voice. A voice she hadn't heard in years. Sarah, help me. She stopped dead in her tracks, her blood running cold. The voice, it was her mother's voice. No, her mind screamed. This can't be happening. But as she turned to face the empty hallway behind her, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the darkness, her mother's face appeared. Sarah's heart stopped, frozen by the apparition that stood before her. There, in the darkness of the hallway, was her mother's face, pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow, staring at Sarah with an expression that should have been comforting but was now filled with something else, something sinister. It wasn't just the familiar face of the woman who had raised her, who had loved her, but something wrong with it, something that didn't belong. The voice echoed again, faint, distant, almost a whisper. Sarah, help me. Her mind raced, the memories rushing back like a floodgate opening. Her mother had disappeared years ago, vanished without a trace. No one ever found out what happened to her. The police had stopped searching after a few months, and the case had gone cold. But Sarah had never stopped searching. Not really. In her heart, she had always known, always suspected, that something horrible had happened, something connected to this house. Now here was her mother, or what was left of her. Her legs trembled, and she backed away instinctively, but the figure of her mother only seemed to draw closer, its features warping, becoming more distorted with each step. The darkness around her grew heavier, like the air itself was pressing against her, trying to hold her in place. No, this isn't real, Sarah whispered to herself, shaking her head furiously. It's just a trick. It's all in my head. But the figure didn't disappear. It followed her. The voice came again, louder now, filled with desperation. Sarah, please, help me. Tears stung Sarah's eyes as she turned, looking for an escape. She had to get out of this house. It wasn't just the thing in the shadows that was tormenting her. It was this place, the memories, the history it held. The walls seemed to close in on her, the house itself alive with the past, with her mother's lost soul. It wasn't just the supernatural force that haunted this place. It was everything. The people who had lived here, the dark secrets they carried, and the ghosts that never found rest. Her feet moved on their own, carrying her down the hallway. The figure of her mother followed, its face twisting with every step Sarah took, like the very shadows were warping it, shaping it into something worse. But then, just as Sarah reached the top of the stairs, something caught her eye. A door, hidden in the corner of the hall, barely noticeable, covered in dust and cobwebs. It was old, its paint chipped and peeling, the handle rusted with age. It was a door she had never seen before, and yet it felt familiar. It was as though it had always been there, waiting for her to find it. Sarah didn't know why, but she felt drawn to it. The sense of wrongness that had gripped her since she arrived in this place seemed to concentrate around that door, like the air itself was warning her not to open it. But the voice of her mother, her distorted, pleading voice, pulled her forward. She reached out, trembling, and turned the handle. The door creaked open with an agonizing slowness, revealing a small, cramped room. It was dark, the air heavy with dust, and the walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn in what looked like blood. The floor was littered with old, decaying books and furniture, but the worst part, the part that made Sarah's blood run cold, was the small, faded photograph on the floor. She bent down and picked it up, her fingers trembling as she dusted it off. The photo was old, yellowed with age. It showed a woman, a young woman, standing in front of a house that looked eerily similar to the one she was standing in now. The woman was smiling, but there was something off about her eyes. They were dark, hollow, like they knew something she didn't. And then, in the corner of the photo, in small, faded writing, was a name, Sarah. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the name, at the woman, at the photograph that shouldn't have existed. There was no way, this couldn't be real. This isn't my mother. But the name, her name, was there, unmistakable. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing tighter with every breath. Her mind spun. Who is this woman? Why is she in the picture? She stood up quickly, her legs shaking, and backed away from the room. But as she did, she saw it. In the far corner of the room, barely visible in the darkness, was something, or someone, hunched over, motionless. A body. Her heart stopped. Sarah's mouth went dry, and she took a step back, her feet tripping over something on the floor. Her eyes never left the form in the corner. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. It was too still, too wrong. But then, as if to confirm her worst fear, it moved. The figure jerked its head up, its eyes wide and staring at Sarah, its face twisted in agony. It was a woman. But it wasn't her mother. It couldn't be. This woman had no skin, just raw, bloody muscle, and the eyes were empty, lifeless. The thing that had once been a person opened its mouth, and the most horrific sound filled the room, a hollow, guttural scream that rattled the bones and made Sarah's knees give way. The figure lunged toward her, its arms reaching, dragging itself forward with horrifying speed. Sarah screamed, stumbling back, but her legs gave out. She hit the floor hard, her body slamming into the ground with a sickening thud. The thing's fingers were inches from her face, but then, it stopped, frozen. The air went deathly still. The room became so quiet Sarah could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The thing that had been moving toward her was now standing perfectly still, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles, its face frozen in that horrific, open-mouthed scream. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come back, Sarah." The air around her grew cold, colder than it had ever been before, and she knew, that she had made a terrible mistake. She wasn't just in the house of her past. She was trapped in it. The thing's fingers twitched. Sarah could only stare as it began to move toward her again. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat as the twisted figure crawled toward her, its skeletal limbs snapping into place with unnatural jerks. The grotesque face grinned, the edges of its mouth stretching far beyond what a human should be able to do. The room around her seemed to fade, the walls closing in as her focus zeroed in on the approaching horror. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't even move. It was the photo, the one with her name written in the corner, the woman in front of the house. Everything came crashing into her mind. This house, this cursed place, it wasn't just her past star. It was her future. The thing was still coming. The air around her turned frigid, the cold creeping through her skin, wrapping around her ribs, squeezing the breath from her chest. But in the back of her mind, a whisper, a thought, or maybe a memory tugged at her. The door, she thought. There was another door in this house. She knew it. She had seen it in the photographs, hidden away in the back of the house. She didn't know how she knew, but it was there waiting. With what little strength she had left, Sarah crawled backward, her hands skimming the cold floor as she pushed herself away from the creature, her body trembling with each movement. The thing moved closer, faster now, its limbs stretching unnaturally, the dark, hollow eyes never leaving her. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't stay here. She needed to find the door. Her heart pounded in her chest, nearly bursting from the pressure, but she had to move, had to find a way out. She dragged herself across the floor, feeling the cold sting of the stone beneath her fingertips, hearing the sickening scraping sound of the thing's movements behind her. Her pulse raced. The darkness was swallowing her whole. And then she saw it. The door. It wasn't just a door. It was the door. The one she had been searching for, the one that had haunted her memories and dreams. It stood at the far end of the room, partially open, the darkness beyond it deep and endless. The light inside seemed wrong, like it was flickering in a way it shouldn't. But it was her only chance. With a scream she didn't recognize as her own, Sarah shoved herself to her feet and sprinted toward the door, her body fueled by terror and desperation. Her lungs burned as she stumbled forward, but the creature was closer now, its shrill, inhuman screech filling the air, as if it knew she was trying to escape. The ground trembled beneath her, the house shaking with the force of its approach. She reached for the door, her hand grasping the handle with a desperation that bordered on madness. It was cold to the touch, but it opened easily, as if the house itself was allowing her to pass. Without looking back, she stepped through. And then, nothing. For a long moment, there was only the silence. The stillness. She stood in a vast, empty room, the air warm and thick with the smell of dust. The room was dimly lit, its walls lined with wooden shelves, crammed with old books and objects, but there was something about it, something wrong. And then she saw it. In the center of the room was an old rocking chair, swaying gently, its movement slow and deliberate. A small figure sat in it, hidden beneath a long, ragged cloak. The chair creaked with each movement, the sound echoing off the walls. Sarah's breath hitched as she stepped closer. There, in the dim light, she could see the face of the figure. A face that was too familiar, one she had seen in the photographs in her memories, but it was different now. It was her. Her own face, staring back at her, pale and lifeless, eyes dark as if they were voids. A grin stretched across the face, wide and knowing. "No," Sarah whispered, backing away. This isn't real." But the figure in the chair only rocked gently, its gaze fixed on Sarah. And then, with a voice that was both her own and yet not, it spoke. "You've come home, Sarah." Her heart thudded in her chest, a heavy weight pressing on her lungs. The voice was a perfect echo of her own, and yet it wasn't. It was distorted, like something trying to remember but failing. It was a voice filled with years of torment. "No," Sarah cried. "I don't belong here. This place isn't mine." The figure laughed softly, a hollow, disturbing sound that seemed to fill the room. "It's always been yours, Sarah. Always." She turned, desperate to escape, but the door she had come through was gone. The walls around her began to pulse, the air thickening as if the room itself were closing in on her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The figure in the chair stood now, its movements jerky and unnatural. It took a step toward her, and Sarah stumbled backward, her mind whirling with fear. "You can't run from this, Sarah," the figure said, its voice becoming more distorted, more like something else, something ancient. "This is your fate. It's always been your fate." A shadow loomed behind it, long and dark, stretching across the floor as if reaching for her. It was the same shape as the thing that had chased her, the creature that had haunted her every step in this house. "No," Sarah screamed, turning toward the wall, her hands scrambling at the surface, searching for an escape. But it was too late. The shadow overtook her. Its cold, clammy fingers wrapped around her ankles, dragging her back toward the center of the room. The figure's eyes glowed in the dim light, watching her, smiling with a smile that was too wide, too knowing. "Welcome home, Sarah," the voice whispered again, and this time, it wasn't just the figure speaking. It was the house. It was the past. And with that, the darkness swallowed her whole. Story 2. It was the sound that did it. A single, faint creak of wood from somewhere deeper in the house. A soft, sickening noise that sliced through the thick silence, like the first crack of a bone in a quiet room. The floorboards had been still, untouched, for days. But something was there now. Something waiting. As Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, the cold draft brushed past him, the hairs on the back of his neck lifting. He hadn't meant to stop here, but it had been hours since he'd passed through the first town, and the sun had already slipped behind the horizon, leaving only the dying light of the day to guide him. He'd been looking for a place to rest, to warm himself. The storm, which had started as a light drizzle, was now beating down against the old windows with the kind of fury that seemed unnatural. The house, an old, crumbling mansion tucked away at the edge of the forest, had caught his eye, an eerie silhouette against the darkening sky. Its crooked chimneys, darkened windows, and ivy-clad exterior screamed abandonment, but Ethan couldn't ignore the pull it had on him. Something about the house felt familiar, though he had never been here before. When he knocked on the door, there had been no answer. He had waited a few moments, feeling the chill of the wind bite through his jacket before he turned the handle. The door had creaked open on its own, uninvited, as though the house had been expecting him. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the walls sagging under the weight of time. The floorboards had long since buckled, creaking with every step. But it was quiet. Too quiet. Except for that one lingering creak. He swallowed, his throat dry. He hadn't planned on staying the night. But now that he was here, there was something that made him hesitate to leave. Some nagging sensation in the pit of his stomach that warned him to stay. The light from his flashlight danced along the walls, catching fragments of old photographs and faded tapestries that lined the hallway. There was something almost sad about it. A forgotten history hanging in the air, lingering like the scent of something rotting just beneath the surface. Ethan stepped further into the dark, his boots muffling the echo of his footsteps. His mind kept returning to the house's strange, distant draw, a pull he couldn't explain. Why had he come here? What was it about this place? Another creak. He turned sharply, his flashlight darting toward the sound. The hallway stretched before him, longer than it should have been, or at least that's how it felt. No doors. Just a narrow passage that seemed to wind on forever. There was something else too. Something strange in the air. Felt heavy, oppressive, like the weight of something unseen pressing down on him. The flashlight's beam flickered, and for a brief, terrible second, Ethan thought he saw something. A shadow, tall and thin, slipped past the doorway at the end of the hall. It was gone before he could register it fully, but the flash of movement was enough to freeze him in place. His breath hitched. Hello? His voice sounded weak, too small for such a vast, empty space. The word echoed back to him, distorted by the darkness. Nothing. Another creak. This time it was closer. Too close. Ethan spun around, his heart pounding. There was nothing. Just the darkened corners of the hallway and the oppressive weight of silence. His mind raced as he tried to calm himself. It was just an old house, he told himself. Of course the wood would creak. The wind howled outside, pushing against the house like some unseen force trying to get in. But the thing was, the house didn't feel like it was simply old. It felt alive. And that was the part that terrified him. A chill ran down his spine, colder than the draft coming from the open windows. He wanted to turn and run, get back in his car and leave, but something held him in place. He felt as if the house itself were watching him, its decaying walls eager to consume him, pull him deeper into its secrets. Another creak, louder this time. The floor beneath his feet groaned as if protesting his every move. Ethan glanced toward the staircase ahead. The second floor. There had to be a way out of here. Without thinking, he took a step forward. The floorboard beneath his boot gave way with a loud crack, sending him stumbling, his flashlight clattering to the ground. He cursed under his breath, struggling to regain his balance, his chest tightening. When he reached down to grab the flashlight, his hand froze. There, just at the edge of the light's beam, was a small, faded photograph. A family standing outside the house, their faces worn and faded with age. But the eyes, those eyes, stared directly at him, as though they knew him. He picked it up, his hands trembling. The faces in the photo were indistinct, the edges fraying with time. But the look in their eyes, it was impossible to ignore. It was as if they were staring straight through him. Suddenly, the floor creaked again, this time from behind him. A soft whisper. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The whisper was faint but unmistakable. His name. Ethan. The whisper faded as quickly as it had come, leaving only the sound of his heart hammering in his chest. Ethan stood motionless, the photograph still clutched in his shaking hands, his eyes darting around the room. The oppressive silence returned, thick and suffocating, but it no longer felt safe. It felt like a warning. He didn't know how long he stood there, frozen to the spot, staring at the photograph of the family. Their eyes, they hadn't been normal. There was something unnatural about them, as if they were waiting, watching. The air in the house seemed to grow heavier by the second. Every breath felt labored, like the oxygen was slowly being sucked from the room, leaving only the choking weight of dread in its wake. The floor creaked again, but this time, it wasn't the house settling. It was something else. Something closer. Ethan's head snapped to the side, his breath hitching in his throat as he strained to listen. Nothing. It had come from upstairs, he was sure of it. The sound of footsteps, deliberate and slow, moving across the second-floor landing. He tightened his grip on the photograph, his knuckles white. What was he doing here? Why had he even stepped inside this place? The thought of leaving crossed his mind, but the door, the same door that had creaked open so invitingly earlier, felt miles away now, as though it had somehow shifted in the darkness. The house was not a place you could simply leave. There was no escape. Ethan took a shaky step back, his eyes flicking toward the staircase. He didn't know what he was expecting. There was no one upstairs, right? But the whisper, his name. His heart thudded painfully against his ribs, and the weight of the photograph in his hand seemed to pull him deeper into the house, like an anchor tied to his soul. The footsteps continued, slow and measured. Whoever, Whatever was up there was getting closer. "Hello?" Ethan called, his voice trembling with uncertainty. It sounded weaker than he had intended, more desperate. "Is someone there?" No answer. But the steps kept coming, the creak of each footfall louder now, closer. He couldn't stand still. Not anymore. His body moved before his mind could catch up, his legs carrying him toward the staircase, his heart a frantic drumbeat in his ears. The flashlight lay discarded on the floor, but it didn't matter. There was no need for it. There was only the growing certainty that he had to go upstairs, had to know who, or what, was there. Ethan reached the bottom of the stairs. The wooden steps groaned under his weight, as if the house itself was objecting to his intrusion. The temperature seemed to drop with each step he took. His breath clouded in front of him, thick and visible, and his footsteps seemed too loud in the stillness, echoing like a warning. He reached the top. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before him. A faded carpet ran along the floor, its once vibrant colors now dulled and threadbare. There were doors on either side, some cracked open, others closed, but there was no sign of the footsteps. The eerie silence that had enveloped the house before had returned, but it felt different now. It was waiting for him. Ethan's breath came in short gasps. His mouth was dry and his hands felt clammy. He took another step forward, his eyes scanning the corridor. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. What was upstairs? What was here waiting for him? Then he saw it. A door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. The faintest sliver of light escaped through the gap, casting a thin, trembling beam across the floor. It was the only thing in the house that looked alive. That small sliver of light. He could see it, feel it calling to him. The footsteps hadn't stopped, but now they had changed. They were no longer slow and deliberate. They were erratic, as if something was pacing back and forth, unsure of its next move. And with every step, the whisper returned, barely audible, like a voice caught in the wind. "Ethan." His name. The door at the end of the hallway beckoned. The whispers pulled at his mind, urging him forward. He wanted to run, to leave this place and never look back, but something he couldn't explain, kept him there, frozen. The house was alive in a way that made the air feel thick, suffocating, as though the walls themselves were watching him, listening. He took a tentative step toward the door. The whisper grew louder. "Ethan." Closer now, as though it was no longer just a voice, but something more. Something tangible, wrapping itself around his thoughts. He reached out, his hand trembling, and grasped the cold, brass doorknob. The second his fingers made contact, the whisper stopped. The house was dead silent again, as if the world itself had held its breath. His hand, still on the knob, froze. For a moment, there was nothing but the eerie quiet, and then a cold hand clamped down over his, stopping him from turning the knob. His skin crawled as the coldness seeped through him, an unnatural chill that made him want to scream. But no sound came. He yanked his hand back, stumbling away from the door, his heart racing. But the hand didn't let go. The chill lingered, spreading up his arm like ice, creeping into his chest. There was something inside that room. Something waiting. Ethan spun around, his mind reeling, his eyes darting over the dark hallway, searching for a way out. His gaze fell on a window at the far end, but the rain had turned into a violent storm, the sky churning in angry waves of black and gray. There was no escape. A low, creaking sound echoed from behind him. Slowly he turned back to the door. The knob turned on its own. The door creaked open on its own, slowly, unnervingly slow, as if something unseen had taken control of the movement. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the small gap between the door's edge and the frame widened, revealing nothing but darkness. The storm outside howled louder, rattling the old house, and for a moment, it felt like the storm was pouring in through the very walls. The room beyond the door was pitch black, as if it existed in another world entirely. The faint light from the hallway barely touched the edges of the space, and even that seemed to fade away as soon as it entered. The air smelled musty, thick with dust, and yet, there was something else. A heavy, sickly sweetness, like something decaying just out of sight. The whisper that had been haunting him returned, this time louder, sharper. "Come in." Ethan's pulse quickened. He wanted to turn and run, he knew he should, but his feet refused to move. The words echoed in his mind, not just from his ears but from the very walls themselves, wrapping around him, pulling him closer. It was a voice that wasn't just speaking, it was demanding, calling him. Ethan. His name, but not his own voice. This was something else. Something ancient and familiar, as though it had always known him. He reached for the doorframe, bracing himself against the cold, damp wood, and with one last glance at the hallway behind him, he stepped into the room. The instant he crossed the threshold, the air shifted. The temperature dropped, colder than he had ever felt before, a deep, biting cold that seemed to gnaw at his very bones. He could hear the wind outside, still howling, but now it was muffled, like it was trying to get in but was trapped behind the walls. The room stretched in front of him, though he couldn't see much. His eyes slowly adjusted to the blackness, the faintest outline of furniture emerging from the shadows. A chair, a table, a large, ornate mirror on the far wall. And in the corner, just barely visible, was something else. Something far worse. A figure. At first, it was nothing more than a silhouette, tall and thin like a person but wrong. The shape seemed to shimmer, its edges flickering in and out of focus, like the image was trying to hold together but kept dissolving. It was almost as if the room itself was trying to push it away to keep it hidden. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he stepped forward, his breath shallow and erratic. The room felt alive, pulsating with something malevolent, something that didn't want him there. The figure moved. Slowly, unsteadily at first, but then with a smooth, unnerving grace. Ethan felt his body freeze, his legs locked in place, his instincts screaming at him to run. But he couldn't. His feet were rooted to the floor, his body unwilling to move as the figure approached, its face hidden in shadow. Then it spoke. Ethan. The voice was soft, but the sound of his name was enough to send a chill so deep through his body that it felt like his bones were turning to ice. He could feel it now, the pull, the compulsion to obey, to step closer, to do whatever it asked. He fought it. He had to. But the figure's presence was overwhelming. The darkness seemed to close in around him, suffocating, and the whisper was growing louder, more insistent. Come closer. Ethan shook his head, taking a step back. But the figure only followed, its movements smooth, effortless, like it had all the time in the world. Each step it took seemed to bring it closer, pulling him into its orbit. The room itself seemed to grow darker, the shadows creeping along the walls like tendrils, curling around the furniture, the mirror, and even the figure. Ethan's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he backed away, his eyes darting toward the door, but it was gone. The hallway was no longer there. The door had vanished, replaced by walls that seemed to close in on him, sealing him in. No way out. No, I don't belong here, Ethan shouted, his voice trembling as he turned toward the figure. I don't belong here. But the figure didn't respond. Instead, it stopped moving, hovering just out of reach, its shape flickering in and out of focus. For a moment, it was almost as if the figure was smiling. The darkness seemed to swallow its face, the empty void of its expression mocking him. Ethan's stomach churned. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. Then a low, guttural sound vibrated through the room. A scraping noise, like nails against glass. Ethan looked toward the source of the noise, his heart threatening to tear from his chest. There, in the far corner, behind the figure, the mirror. The glass was shaking, rippling like water disturbed by some unseen force. The reflection inside it was wrong. It wasn't his own. It wasn't even a reflection at all. There was someone else in the mirror. A woman. Her face was pale, almost sickly, and her eyes, those eyes, stared directly at him. Her mouth moved, but the words were silent, as if she were speaking through the glass itself, unable to reach him. Ethan stepped back, his hand shaking as he tried to reach for the door, but it was still gone. The room was alive, closing in on him, its walls pressing in with a sickening weight. Leave, the figure in the room finally spoke, but its voice wasn't the one he had heard before. This was deeper, more distorted, as if several voices were layered together. Leave, while you still can. The mirror crackled, the glass beginning to splinter at the edges. And then the woman in the reflection began to scream. The mirror shattered. For a moment, the sound of cracking glass seemed to linger in the air, stretching the silence into something unbearable. Ethan froze, his breath caught in his throat as shards of glass scattered across the floor like broken teeth. The reflection of the woman, her pale, agonized face, was gone, replaced by a jagged web of shards, each fragment reflecting a fractured image of the room, of Ethan himself, staring back with wide, horrified eyes. But it was the cry that broke the stillness. The woman's scream, high-pitched and raw, echoed through the room like a banshee's wail, so sharp that it seemed to pierce the very air around him. The sound curled through his mind, scraping against the edges of his sanity. Ethan stumbled back, his body trembling uncontrollably, his legs threatening to give way beneath him. The walls seemed to press in closer, the space narrowing, suffocating. There was no escape. The room was alive, and whatever had been in that mirror was no longer bound by glass. And then the crying woman's voice was no longer just a scream. It was a whisper. Ethan. Her voice was softer now, but no less terrifying. It crawled under his skin, settling into his bones like poison. The words wrapped themselves around his thoughts, urging him to listen, to understand, to come closer. Ethan's eyes flicked to the fragments of the shattered mirror. The room felt colder, the air thicker. And somewhere in the depths of the darkness, there was a presence. Something unseen, something waiting. The whispering grew louder. "Please, you have to help me." The plea was desperate, fragile, like the final breath of a drowning person. It clung to the air, drawing him in, making him feel like he had no choice but to move toward it. His body felt heavy, as though the air itself had thickened, turning solid and oppressive. But his legs, they didn't obey him anymore. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his feet refused to move, as though they were bound by invisible chains. The figure in the corner, the thing that had been flickering in and out of existence, was still there. Ethan could feel its presence, cold and unyielding, standing like an immovable shadow. And behind him, in the room, the air was rippling, twisting, as if reality itself was warping. "Ethan?" The voice of the woman was louder now, more insistent. "You have to listen. Please, you have to understand." The words were jumbled, distorted, like they were being dragged through a haze of static. The figure in the corner stepped forward, its face hidden by darkness, its form shifting like smoke. And then, just as suddenly as it had moved, it stopped. The room was quiet again, save for the woman's pleading voice. "Help me," she cried again, her voice so faint, so distant, that Ethan barely heard it. "Help me before it's too late." The air seemed to thicken with the weight of her words. The pressure on his chest grew unbearable, squeezing the air from his lungs. He tried to call out, tried to ask what she wanted, but his throat was dry, parched, and the words wouldn't come. Then the room changed. The darkness deepened, the corners of the room stretching like a living thing. The furniture began to shift, the shadows curling around the table and chairs, pulling them toward the center of the room. The mirror shards scattered across the floor began to shift as well, pulling toward the broken reflection like magnets, dragging the glass back into place with a sickening grinding sound. The figure that had once stood in the corner was now moving, its shape solidifying. Ethan could see it more clearly now. A woman draped in tattered, blackened robes, her face obscured by the shadows. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Only the silent cry of her pain and rage seemed to reverberate through the air. The crying woman. Her outstretched hands reached for him, fingers curling like claws, as if to pull him into the darkness with her. Ethan stumbled backward, his legs shaking beneath him, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the house pressing down on him, the walls closing in tighter, and the shadows around him seemed to grow, swallowing the light. "Leave me alone," he shouted, the words finally spilling from his mouth. But his voice was weak, barely a whisper against the overwhelming force of the room. The woman's head tilted, her face still obscured by shadow, but Ethan could feel her eyes on him, cold, accusing eyes. She was looking at him like she knew him, like she had always known him. And then the whispers returned, louder, insistent. "Why did you leave me, Ethan? Why did you abandon me?" The words hit him like a physical blow. The room seemed to shake with the force of her words, the walls bending, stretching, as if the house itself was alive, responding to her anger. Ethan's breath hitched. His body froze as the full weight of her question crashed down on him. Abandon her? He didn't know who she was. He had never seen her before. But the words lingered in his mind, the accusation hanging in the air, heavy and suffocating. He looked around wildly, his eyes darting to the door, but it was still gone. There was no way out. The woman's form was closing in on him, her hands reaching for him with a frantic urgency. "Help me, Ethan. I never left you." The walls seemed to pulse with her words, like the beating of a heart, each thump louder than the last. The ground beneath him trembled, and Ethan could feel the darkness pressing in closer. The cold, her cold, was wrapping around him, suffocating him. The mirror, the shards of glass, rose from the floor, floating toward him like a swarm of deadly insects. The glass sliced through the air, cutting through the shadows as they formed into a shape. And then, with a sudden, horrifying clarity, Ethan saw it. The face of the woman in the mirror. Her eyes were hollow, empty. Her mouth twisted into a smile that was anything but comforting. Her skin was pale, stretched thin like parchment, and her hair hung in wet, matted strands around her face. "Ethan?" she whispered, the smile widening, growing impossibly wide, stretching until it seemed to split her face in two. "You never left me, did you?" The question hung in the air, chilling and final. And then the glass shattered once more. The glass shattered once more, the sound ringing in Ethan's ears long after the shards had fallen to the floor. His heart thundered in his chest, his legs weak, shaking as if they could no longer support him. The darkness was everywhere now, creeping over him like a living thing, suffocating the air. His hands trembled as he wiped his face, but the sweat that slicked his skin only made it worse. The woman's face, the one in the shattered mirror, still lingered in his mind, her twisted smile a memory that refused to fade. The way she had whispered his name, the accusation in her voice, it was like a brand seared into his soul. Ethan couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could do was stumble backward, his eyes wild, looking for any escape, any shred of normalcy. But there was nothing. Nothing but darkness. "Get out," he gasped, barely recognizing the sound of his own voice. It was hoarse, strained. "Leave me alone." But the house had other plans. The walls groaned, shifting like a living entity as if responding to his words. The floor beneath his feet began to vibrate, a low hum reverberating through his bones. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the house itself was alive, its every creak and groan a deliberate movement, a warning. Then, in the corner of the room, something stirred. The shadows seemed to grow, elongating and twisting, pulling together as if to form a shape. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The figure was there again. The woman. Her form flickered in and out of existence, like a malfunctioning image on an old television screen. Her body moved in jerky, unnatural motions, each movement sharp and sudden, as if she was trying to escape from something worse than the darkness surrounding them both. Her face remained obscured, hidden behind a mask of shadow. But Ethan could feel her presence, her eyes on him, watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. A sudden crash from somewhere in the distance made him jump. The floorboards groaned in protest as something, or someone, moved above him. The sound was heavy, like the weight of 1,000 footsteps. The woman's figure flickered again, and this time Ethan saw it clearly, her hand reaching out toward him, her fingers long and bony, the skin stretched tight over her bones. She was close, too close, and her breath was warm against his ear. "I know what you're looking for, Ethan." Her voice was like ice, slithering into his thoughts, curling around his brain, seeping into the very marrow of his bones. "You're looking for the truth. But truth comes at a price." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it was louder than any shout. It was the truth he had been running from, the truth he had buried deep inside, the truth he could no longer ignore. "What are you talking about?" Ethan gasped, his voice trembling. He tried to back away, but his legs didn't respond, as though they had forgotten how to move. The woman's form moved closer, a few feet away, and her eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, finally emerged from the shadows. They were dark, soulless, as if all the light had been drained from them. There was no warmth in them, only emptiness. "You already know," she whispered, her voice shaking with a long-forgotten grief. "The truth you've buried. The secrets you've locked away." Ethan's head swam. His stomach twisted. He could feel the truth clawing its way up from the depths of his mind, a truth he hadn't allowed himself to face in years. It was there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed. "No," he breathed, his voice cracking with the weight of the realization. "No, I didn't leave you." Her lips curled upward into a smile, but it was not kind. It was twisted, cruel, as if she knew the very depth of his shame. "You left me, Ethan. You left me to die." Her voice rose, becoming a screech, a wail of agony that reverberated through the house. "And you thought you could run away?" Ethan shook his head violently, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and panic. He tried to make sense of her words, but they didn't add up. He couldn't understand. He couldn't. The ground beneath his feet trembled again, harder this time, shaking with such force that it threw him to the floor. Ethan's hands reached out, grasping at the splintered floorboards, but they were slick with something cold and wet, like blood. A sudden realization hit him, sharp and nauseating. The wetness, the scent, it wasn't blood. It was something else, something far worse. As his eyes searched the ground, he saw it. The floorboards, those old, creaking planks that had been here since the house was built, were cracking, splintering. There was something beneath them, something that had been buried long ago. Ethan's breath caught as he stared at the crack widening before him. The woman's voice echoed again, and this time, there was no mistaking the words. "Do you remember what you did? What you buried beneath the floor?" Ethan's heart stopped. His blood ran cold as the truth exploded in his mind. He hadn't just left her. He had abandoned her. The woman had been his sister. Years ago, so many years ago, she had been the one who had taken care of him when their parents died. She had been the one who had tried to protect him from the world, from the darkness that surrounded them. But Ethan, in his blind panic and desperation to escape the horrors of their past, had left her behind. He had chosen to flee, to bury himself in a life that would make him forget. But she hadn't been able to escape, and now she was coming for him. The floorboards cracked open, and Ethan's stomach twisted as something reached up from the depths below. Something cold, something clawing and terrible, its fingers like jagged, broken nails. His body was frozen, his mind paralyzed by the revelation. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. He was trapped in this nightmare, in this house, with the ghost of his past. The floor split open completely, and out of the darkness beneath, a hand, no, a claw, emerged, reaching for him, pulling him toward the abyss. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. "I'm sorry. Please forgive me." But there was no forgiveness here. The house, the darkness, the woman, they were all one now, and they were coming for him. Ethan's body jerked violently as the clawed hand grabbed hold of his ankle. His entire world tilted, the darkness swallowing him whole. The weight of the unseen force tugged at him relentlessly, pulling him closer to the floor's jagged edge. He could feel the icy coldness of it creeping up his leg, seeping through his flesh like poison. His mind raced, desperate for a way out, but the more he struggled, the tighter the grip became. The shadows seemed to close in around him, thick and suffocating, wrapping around his chest like a noose. He gasped for air, but it was like breathing in smoke, dense, suffocating, and heavy with the scent of decay. "Let me go," he shouted, his voice strained and panicked. His hands clawed at the floorboards, his nails scraping against the wood as if trying to hold on to reality itself. "Please, I didn't mean it. I'm sorry." The woman's voice answered, a soft, melodic whisper that was somehow more terrifying than any scream. "Sorry isn't enough," she said. Her tone was cold, detached, like a judge reading a verdict. "You left me, Ethan. You abandoned me, and now you must face the consequences." The claw around his ankle tightened, and Ethan screamed, the sound lost in the dark. His body was pulled closer to the opening in the floor, his feet skimming the jagged edges of the cracked wood. The claw was pulling harder now, dragging him toward the unseen depths below. He felt like he was slipping into another world, one where the rules of the living no longer applied. In his panic, Ethan glanced toward the woman, the ghostly figure who had haunted him since the moment he'd set foot in this cursed house. She stood in the corner, her form barely visible in the shadows, but her eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, were locked on him with unrelenting focus. There was no emotion in them, only a deep, unshakable emptiness. "Please," Ethan pleaded again, his voice trembling, his thoughts scrambling for a way out. "I didn't want this. I didn't want any of this." The woman tilted her head as if considering his words, but then, with a slight, eerie smile, she shook her head. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said softly, almost pityingly. "You should have stayed away, Ethan. You should have never come back." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the claw pulled him closer. The darkness beneath the floor seemed to expand, a gaping mouth opening wide to swallow him whole. His eyes darted around in a desperate search for anything that might save him. His hand brushed against something cold and wet. His fingers wrapped around it instinctively, and when he pulled it into view, his breath caught in his throat. It was a photograph, yellowed with age and stained with something dark, something old. The image was faded, but he could still make out the faces in the photo. His family, smiling together in front of their old home. But there was something wrong with the picture. Someone was missing. His sister. The photo had been taken before everything had fallen apart, before he'd made the choice to leave her behind. "Why didn't you come for me?" the woman whispered, her voice echoing in his mind. "Why didn't you save me?" Ethan's mind was spinning. The house, the shadows, the claw pulling him down, everything was starting to blur together. The photo in his hand burned like fire, a reminder of everything he had abandoned. The darkness around him pressed in harder now, as though it were trying to crush him. He could hear her voice again, louder this time, filled with the weight of years of pain and anger. "You were too late, Ethan," she hissed, the words twisting in his ears. "You're always too late." The claws tightened around his ankle, pulling him closer to the depths below. Panic surged through him, and he tried to kick free, but his legs refused to cooperate. His body was growing heavier, weighed down by the suffocating force of the house. The shadows were everywhere now, pressing in on him from all sides. He had to escape. He had to get out of here. With every ounce of strength he could muster, Ethan shoved the photo into his pocket and dug his hands into the floor, clawing for purchase. His fingers scraped the wood, but the surface was slick, as if something was preventing him from breaking free. "Why didn't you come for me?" The voice was louder now, more insistent, and it echoed through the room, filling every corner, every crevice. It wasn't just her voice anymore. It was all the voices of everyone Ethan had left behind. His parents, his sister, his past. The house was alive with them, their whispers rising into a cacophony of rage and sorrow. Ethan's eyes widened in horror as the walls around him seemed to pulse with life, as though the house itself was breathing. He could feel its heartbeat, a slow, steady thrum beneath the floorboards. It was a living, breathing entity, and it had been waiting for him to return. "I didn't leave you," Ethan whispered, though the words felt hollow. "I didn't leave you." But the shadows didn't care. The claw around his ankle tightened once more, dragging him closer to the floor's gaping maw. The darkness was swallowing him whole. And then, just as he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the world around him shifted. The air grew cold, and for a brief moment, the house seemed to hold its breath. A voice echoed in the distance, faint but unmistakable. A whisper. A name. Ethan. It wasn't the woman. It wasn't the voices of his past. It was something else, something deeper, darker. Something older. The shadows shuddered. The ground beneath him trembled. And in the distance, through the crack in the floor, a pair of glowing eyes appeared. Ethan's heart raced as the eyes in the darkness stared at him. They were not the eyes of the woman, nor were they the hollow voids of his past. These eyes were different, darker, deeper, more ancient. They glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, like two burning embers in the vast abyss. They weren't just watching him. They were studying him. The grip on his ankle tightened once more, and the world around him seemed to distort, as if the very walls of the house were bending, stretching, and reshaping themselves to accommodate this new presence. The air was thick with the smell of rot, dampness, and decay, like the earth itself had been forgotten, buried beneath years of silent suffering. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps. His chest tightened with a deep, primal fear that he couldn't explain. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to get away from those eyes, from the very darkness itself, but his limbs refused to obey. It was as if the house had wrapped itself around him, trapping him in its suffocating embrace. The glowing eyes blinked slowly, their gaze unwavering. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, it spoke. "You've come back," it said, its tone ancient, like the sound of stones grinding against one another. "After all this time, you return?" The words resonated within Ethan's mind, curling around his thoughts like smoke. He couldn't tell if the voice was real or if it was some twisted figment of his imagination, but it felt alive. It felt as though the house itself was speaking to him, demanding something from him. "I don't understand," Ethan whispered, his voice barely a breath, his throat dry. What are you?" The eyes blinked again, the faint light flickering in the darkness. The room seemed to grow colder, the air pressing against his skin like a physical force. "I am the keeper of this place," the voice rumbled, sending a shiver down his spine. "I am the one who waits. And you are the one who abandoned it all." The words hit Ethan like a blow to the chest. The keeper? The one who waits? It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. Abandoned what? Ethan's voice cracked and his breath caught in his throat. "I don't even remember this place. I don't remember any of it. I just came back." The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of it pressing down on him like an unshakable force. Then the voice returned, softer now but no less chilling. "You remember more than you think," it whispered, the words slipping into his mind like a poison. "You remember the fear, the loss, the promises you made and the promises you broke." Ethan's stomach turned. The image of the photograph in his pocket flashed before his eyes, the picture of his family, of the home he had left behind. The haunting face of his sister lingered in his thoughts, her eyes wide with something, pleading, begging, but it wasn't just her face. No, it was the faces of all the people he had abandoned in his pursuit of escape. His parents, his past, his regrets. The darkness around him seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if feeding off his guilt, his fears. The floor beneath him creaked as though the house itself was shifting, rearranging, bending to the will of whatever ancient thing resided in the shadows. "Why now?" Ethan managed to choke out. "Why are you doing this to me? What do you want?" The eyes flickered, their glow dimming for a moment before reigniting with a fierceness that sent a chill crawling down Ethan's spine. "I want nothing from you," the voice whispered, the coldness in its words chilling his very soul. "I do not hunger for your flesh. No, I hunger for your truth. The truth you've buried deep within you. The truth you tried to forget." Ethan's head spun. He could feel his mind unraveling, the edges of his thoughts beginning to blur. He had always felt like there was something hidden within him, some dark part of his past he'd locked away and refused to face. But this presence seemed to know more about him than he did. His chest tightened, a feeling of suffocation clawing at his throat. He couldn't breathe. The house was too close. The air was too thick. The claw around his ankle released suddenly, and Ethan jerked in surprise. He scrambled backward, his hands finding purchase on the floorboards as he pushed himself away from the edge. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins, but the darkness wasn't finished with him yet. The eyes blinked again, and the voice rose once more, louder this time, as if it were inside his head, echoing in the chambers of his mind. "You think you can run?" it hissed. "You think you can escape me? But you are already mine, Ethan. You always were." Ethan gasped, his breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. The shadows around him seemed to close in tighter, like a vice squeezing the very air from his lungs. The house had become a living, breathing entity, suffocating him with its weight. "I'm not yours," Ethan gasped, his voice raw with desperation. "I'm not." The eyes burned brighter now, their glow intensifying until they were all he could see. The dark, hollow pupils widened, the flame of the ancient presence reaching toward him. "Yes, you are," it whispered, and Ethan's world went black. Ethan woke with a jolt, his body rigid and drenched in sweat. His heart was pounding in his chest, every beat like a drum in the stillness of the house. He blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of the shadows around him. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of dampness and something else, something rotten, as if the walls themselves were decaying. He was lying on the floor, his limbs tangled in the splintered wood, his back aching from where he had been pulled, dragged, and shoved by the malevolent force. His ankle throbbed, and when he reached down to touch it, a sharp, biting pain shot up his leg. The claw had left marks, deep, red welts, that burned as if they were still alive. Ethan tried to sit up, but his body felt sluggish, like he was moving through water. The world around him was eerily quiet, too quiet. The house had fallen into a strange stillness, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He rubbed his face, trying to clear the lingering fog in his mind, but the disorienting images from the shadows, the glowing eyes, the voice that echoed in his skull, still lingered, sharp and unyielding. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It pressed down on him like the weight of the house itself, like it was aware of his every move, his every thought. As he rose unsteadily to his feet, the floor creaked beneath him. His gaze swept across the room, noting the same oppressive darkness that had consumed it before. The walls seemed to close in on him, drawing nearer, as though the house was trying to swallow him whole. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and found his hand instinctively reaching for the photograph in his pocket. It was still there, warm against his skin. He pulled it out, the faded image of his family staring back at him. His fingers trembled as he studied the photo again. His sister's face, her sad, wide eyes, seemed to burn into him, her silent scream echoing in the pit of his stomach. Had it always been this way? Had he always been this afraid? The voice of the house returned, its whispers curling around him, seeping into his thoughts. "Do you feel it?" it asked, its tone a soft, mocking whisper. "Do you feel the truth crawling beneath your skin?" Ethan shoved the photo back into his pocket, refusing to listen. He couldn't. Not now. He couldn't let himself get lost in the memories again. He had to find a way out. The house creaked, a low groan of wood and stone. For a moment he thought he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone was moving just out of view. He turned sharply, his eyes darting toward the hallway, but there was nothing there. Just the thick, swirling shadows. His pulse quickened, and he backed away from the center of the room. He had to leave. He had to escape before it was too late. His thoughts raced as he staggered toward the door. His hand gripped the knob, but it wouldn't budge. He twisted it again, harder this time, his knuckles white with the pressure, but the door refused to open. His mind screamed at him. This isn't real. This can't be real, He pulled harder, his body slamming into the door with all his weight, but it didn't move. The walls groaned, the house seemingly alive with a pulse of its own. And then he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible click, followed by the faint sound of something scraping against the floor. His breath hitched in his throat as he realized it wasn't the door that had moved. It was the floor beneath him. The floorboards shifted with a slow, deliberate motion, as though they were opening up, creating a new, gaping hole where the door once stood. A rift, dark and unfathomable, spread wider with each passing second. Ethan's eyes widened in horror as the very foundation of the house seemed to give way, pulling him closer to the void beneath. "No," he shouted, stepping back. No, not again. But the house had already decided for him. The walls groaned again, and the floor continued to warp beneath him, creaking and cracking as if the house itself was about to collapse. With a strangled cry, Ethan turned away from the hole and bolted toward the other end of the room. His footsteps echoed through the house, loud and hollow as he ran, faster now, driven by the primal need to survive. Every instinct screamed at him to get out. Get away from the house, from whatever had awakened it, from whatever he had unleashed. As he reached the far wall, he stumbled upon a door, hidden in the corner, almost like it hadn't been there before. It stood out against the oppressive shadows, a faint, almost imperceptible light glimmering around its edges. Without thinking, Ethan reached for the handle. The door opened with an eerie, low creak, the hinges grinding like bones being twisted. The air on the other side was cold, bitterly cold, the temperature dropping like a sudden plunge into ice. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping through. The room beyond was dark, too dark to make out anything at first. But as his eyes adjusted, he could see the outlines of old furniture. A chair, a table, a dresser, covered in dust and cobwebs. The room seemed untouched by time, frozen in some long-forgotten era. The floor was made of dark wood, and the walls were lined with faded wallpaper that had once been elegant, now peeling and yellowed with age. As he ventured deeper into the room, his gaze landed on a single object sitting in the center of the room. A large wooden chest, its surface scarred and worn as if it had been moved countless times. There was something about it, something wrong. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he approached, the sense of dread in his chest tightening with each step. The chest was closed, its lid slightly askew as if it were hiding something. Ethan's hand reached for the latch, and as his fingers brushed the cold metal, the voice of the house echoed once more in his mind, cold and clear. Don't open it. But it was too late. The latch clicked open. The chest creaked open with an ominous groan, its ancient hinges protesting the sudden movement. Ethan's heart raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. He had no idea what he was expecting to find. Maybe something that would explain all the madness, something that would help him understand what was happening to him. Or maybe, he realized with a sinking feeling, he was hoping for an escape. But as the lid opened fully, revealing the dark interior, Ethan's stomach twisted with dread. The chest wasn't empty. It was filled with things, objects that seemed ordinary at first, but as his eyes scanned them, a shiver ran down his spine. A rusted key. A broken watch, the hands frozen in time. A small, crumpled piece of paper with strange, half-faded symbols scrawled across it. A child's toy, its porcelain face cracked and chipped, its eyes vacant and empty. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat as he reached for the piece of paper. The symbols on it were alien, twisted, like something out of a nightmare. They looked familiar, though he couldn't quite place them. They made his head swim with a sense of wrongness, as if simply looking at them was enough to unravel the fragile sanity he had left. He turned his attention to the other items in the chest, his hands trembling. His fingers brushed over the watch, and a sudden flash of light blinded him. For a split second, it was as if the room around him shifted, like the very air crackled with energy. He gasped, stumbling back as a feeling of vertigo washed over him, and the chest seemed to grow larger, more imposing. Ethan tried to shake off the dizziness, but his head felt heavy, his thoughts disjointed. His eyes darted from the chest to the room around him. The walls seemed closer now, the shadows deeper. The very air felt thicker, suffocating. He could almost hear the whispers again, faint, like distant voices calling out to him. "Do you remember?" The voice was soft, almost a sigh, but it was unmistakable. Ethan's stomach twisted. He spun around, but the room behind him remained empty, save for the dim light flickering from the chest. There was no one there. There was no one in the house. Or was there? He turned back to the chest, his hand still hovering over the small toy. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. He could feel it, the weight of it pressing against him, tugging at his mind. The house was watching him, waiting for something. But what? Before he could reach for the toy, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, sending the paper with the strange symbols fluttering to the ground. The temperature dropped rapidly, the air biting into his skin as though the very house itself was exhaling ice. Ethan stumbled back, his breath clouding in front of him. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and move, the darkness alive, swirling like a storm in the corners of his vision. His chest tightened and his hands shook uncontrollably. This wasn't just fear, it was something worse. The house was changing, warping into something far darker than before. A sound came from behind him, slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing across the wooden floor. Ethan whirled around, his heart leaping into his throat. But there was no one there. The room was empty, the shadows still, but the footsteps continued, each step resonating in his chest like a distant drumbeat. "Who's there?" His voice cracked, weak, but he couldn't help it. The terror was suffocating him. The footsteps stopped. Dead silence. Then the voice came again, but this time it was louder. Clear. "You should never have opened the chest, Ethan." He whipped around to face the voice, but the room remained empty, just the chest, the shadows, and the oppressive silence. But the voice wasn't just in the room, it was in his head, pressing against his mind like a physical weight. "You've awakened them," the voice continued, the words vibrating in his skull. "The ones who never left. The ones who never forgave." Ethan staggered back toward the door, his mind racing. What had he done? What had he unleashed by opening the chest? Was it the house that was haunting him, or was it something else entirely, something he had brought with him? Something that had been waiting for him, patiently, for all these years? His eyes darted back to the chest, where the broken watch and the toy lay, things that didn't belong to him, things that had never belonged to him. He knew that now. But before he could make another move, a sudden, sharp sound broke the silence. A whisper. Soft at first, but then growing louder. It wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, an echo of voices, murmuring in the shadows, calling his name. Asterisk Ethan. Ethan. Then, asterisk. The whispers grew louder, their tone now frantic, desperate. The walls seemed to close in on him again, the house shifting, alive with their cries. The coldness in the room deepened, and Ethan could feel his sanity slipping away. He backed away from the chest, but the whispers followed him, surrounding him, filling his head with their maddening words. "Do you hear them?" the voice asked, now close to his ear. "They've always been here. And now they want you." Suddenly the toy in the chest jerked to life. Its cracked porcelain face turned toward him, its empty eyes gleaming in the dim light. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The toy blinked, once, twice, and then with a jarring screech, it leapt from the chest, its tiny wooden legs scraping across the floor as it scuttled toward him. Asterisk no, asterisk, Ethan shouted, backing away, his legs tangled in the shadows. But the toy wasn't alone. The broken watch began to tick, slowly at first, then faster, its hands spinning wildly. The rusted key rolled out of the chest, clinking as it slid across the floor toward him, as though drawn by some invisible force. And then, from the darkness they came. Figures, shadowy, twisted forms, emerged from the walls, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes with broken strings. They crawled, they stumbled, and they reached out toward him with long, skeletal hands. Ethan could only watch in horror as they closed in, their cold, dead eyes locking onto him with an unholy hunger. And just as he was about to turn and run, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him in the room with the shadows, with the things that had never left. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as the shadows closed in, their cold, dead eyes never leaving him. The room seemed to shrink with every passing second, the air thick with an oppressive, suffocating energy. He had to move, had to get out. But the door was sealed shut, and the windows, he realized with growing horror, had long since disappeared beneath a layer of shifting darkness. The figures advanced toward him, their movements jerky, as though they were more like broken reflections of something that should have never been. Their limbs twisted unnaturally, contorted in ways that made Ethan's stomach churn. Their hollow faces flickered with a grotesque mockery of life, their lips parting in silent screams, their eyes wide and unblinking. He could feel their cold breath as they neared, their presence like a heavy weight pressing against him. The shadows, they weren't just shadows anymore. They were something worse, something that had taken root in this place, something that had waited for him. Asterisk Ethan asterisk, a voice whispered, one he recognized as his own. But it wasn't his voice. It was a distorted, hollow echo, filled with dread and something deeper, something darker. The figures surrounded him now, closing in from all sides, their fingers brushing against his skin, their presence suffocating. He wanted to scream, to fight, but his body refused to obey, paralyzed by fear. His mind screamed for him to run, to escape, but there was no escape. Not from this. And then, as the first figure reached out toward him, its skeletal hand brushing his shoulder, time seemed to stretch and bend, warping like a nightmare. The world shifted. For a moment, there was nothing, just an unbearable stillness. Ethan blinked, his vision blurry, his senses reeling as if the very fabric of reality had torn open and he had fallen through it. He was no longer in the room with the shadowy figures. He wasn't even sure where he was. The house was gone. Or maybe it was still there, just buried under layers of dust and time. He found himself in a different place entirely, standing on the edge of a desolate street. The air was thick with fog, the kind that clung to your skin and swallowed every sound. There were no lights, no signs of life, just an eerie emptiness. The houses that lined the street were dilapidated, their windows broken, their doors hanging open as if abandoned long ago. A chill ran down his spine. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But it was. He could feel it, the coldness, the weight of the place pressing down on him, suffocating him. The fog swirled around his feet, clinging to his legs, making it hard to move. There was a noise behind him, a faint creak like a door opening. Ethan spun around, but the street remained empty. The fog seemed to pulse, swirling in unnatural patterns, and a whispering voice drifted through the air, low and distant, like the wind carrying words from a faraway place. Asterisk Ethan, asterisk. His breath caught in his throat. The voice, he recognized it, but he couldn't place it. It was the same voice from the house, the voice that had whispered his name over and over. But there was something else in it now, something darker, something that made his skin crawl. He turned, his eyes scanning the fog, desperate to find the source of the voice. But all he saw were shadows, shadows that seemed to move on their own, creeping toward him, stretching unnaturally. Another creak, louder this time. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Something was coming. Something that shouldn't be. He backed away, his breath shallow, his mind racing for any explanation. This place, this empty, forgotten street, was wrong. He knew it, felt it deep in his bones. It was connected to the house somehow. The same darkness, the same malevolent force that had haunted him in the house was here, waiting for him, hiding just beyond his vision. And then he saw it. A figure standing in the fog, just beyond the reach of the dim streetlights. The figure was tall, shrouded in shadows, its features obscured by the mist. But Ethan could feel its gaze on him, a heavy weight pressing against his chest, suffocating him. It was the same figure he had seen in the house. The same shadow, the same twisted form that had reached out to him, calling his name. But now it was different. Now the figure was moving. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step toward him, its shadow stretching unnaturally long, distorting the world around it. Its movements were fluid, but there was a jagged quality to them, like something inhuman, something not entirely of this world. Ethan's legs trembled beneath him as he took a step back. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his body refused to obey. His feet were rooted to the ground as if the fog itself had wrapped around his legs, holding him in place. The figure stopped just short of him, standing there in the silence, its presence suffocating. Ethan could feel its cold, malevolent energy radiating from it, pressing against him like a physical force. The air was thick with it, like the fog itself was alive, hungry. And then the figure spoke. Asterisk, do you remember me, Ethan? Asterisk. The voice was soft, but it cut through the fog like a blade, sharp and clear. Ethan's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. He had heard it before long ago when he was just a child. But that voice had been different then. It had been warm, kind, full of life. But now it was twisted, distorted, filled with something dark, something ancient. It was the voice of someone he had lost. Someone he had tried to forget. The figure stepped forward, its face slowly emerging from the shadows, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as recognition hit him like a wave. It was her, his mother, but not the way he remembered her. Her face was pale, gaunt, her eyes hollow, as if life had drained from her long ago. Her lips curled into a twisted smile, the smile of something that had been dead for a long time. Asterisk, you left me, asterisk, she whispered, her voice a sickening mix of sorrow and accusation. Asterisk, you left me, and now, you must pay the price, asterisk. Ethan stumbled back, his mind racing. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. His mother had died years ago. He had seen it with his own eyes. He had buried her, mourned her, tried to forget her. But this thing in front of him wasn't his mother. It was something else, something far worse, something that had been waiting in the shadows, feeding on his guilt, on his pain. No? Ethan choked out, his voice barely a whisper. This isn't real. You're not her. You're not. But before he could finish, the figure lunged forward, her hands reaching out to grab him, to pull him into the darkness with her. And just as her fingers brushed his skin, the world shattered. Ethan's vision was fractured, like shards of glass scattering across a darkened sky. The fog closed in on him so thick he could barely breathe. The whispers, once distant, were now in his ears, clawing at his mind, each word a sharp blade scraping against his thoughts. They were everywhere. He couldn't escape them. The weight of the past crushed him, and in that moment he knew that the thing in the fog, the thing that had once been his mother, wasn't just here to torment him, it was here to make him remember. To make him relive the nightmare that he had tried so desperately to forget. "She is still here," the voice had said, and the truth of those words rang through him like a bell tolling in the silence of the night. His mother. Her absence had haunted him for so long, a shadow he couldn't outrun. He had run from her love, from her need, from her death, and now it had come for him. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing in on him like a living thing, suffocating him with every breath. Ethan stumbled forward, his legs weak, his body trembling with fear. He needed to move, needed to escape, but escape from what? There was nowhere left to run. And then he heard it. A soft, distant cry, almost like a wail. A sound so familiar, it twisted in his chest, pulling at the deepest parts of him. His mother's voice. The last memory he had of her, a fragile, desperate plea. She had called for him, begged him not to leave her behind. But he had. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He tried to move, tried to find the source of the cry, but it seemed to come from everywhere. The air was thick with her grief, her pain, and something far darker, something that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. He wasn't alone. A shadow moved through the fog ahead of him. His heart skipped a beat. This was it. The thing that had been stalking him. The figure. His mother's twisted reflection, her malevolent presence. He turned quickly, spinning in a frantic circle, but the fog disoriented him. Every step he took felt like a step deeper into the abyss, the shadows closing in from every side. His heart hammered in his chest, his head swimming with confusion. And then there it was. A face. A twisted, contorted face emerging from the fog. Eyes, dark, empty, locked onto his. The figure's expression was grotesque, a mirror of the woman he once knew but now, wrong. The lips moved, forming words, but no sound came from them. Only the cold, oppressive silence. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His pulse surged in his ears. Was this? No, it couldn't be. He had left her. He had walked away from her pleas, from everything that had tied him to this cursed place. But it didn't matter. She had never truly left him. She had followed him, waited for him, and now it was time for the reckoning. The figure took a step forward, its shadow stretching long and dark across the ground. Ethan backed away, panic rising in his chest. He couldn't move fast enough. He couldn't breathe. The fog closed in tighter around him, a suffocating blanket. "Why did you leave me?" the figure whispered, but it wasn't his mother's voice anymore. It was something else. A low, guttural sound that scraped across his sanity like fingernails on glass. The voice, the same voice from his dreams, echoed in his ears. He stumbled backward, his hands reaching out for something, anything to hold on to, but there was nothing. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble, the air growing thick with a terrible energy, like something ancient and powerful awakening. "Why did you leave me?" the voice asked again, louder now, booming in the silence of the fog. Ethan's vision swam. His mind fractured. He could feel the weight of his past, his guilt, pressing down on him, crushing him beneath its burden. He had left her. He had abandoned her. He hadn't been there when she needed him most, and now it was too late. "I'm sorry," he gasped, his voice breaking. But the words felt hollow, empty, lost in the vastness of the fog. The figure advanced. Each step it took was slow, deliberate. The darkness followed, swallowing the light. The air grew colder, and with it, the sense of doom settled deeper into Ethan's bones. It wasn't just the figure he feared. It was the realization that he could never outrun the consequences of his actions. The past had caught up with him, and now it was time to face what he had done. The fog began to swirl violently around him, a whirlwind of shadow and cold. He reached out, feeling for anything that might anchor him to reality, but everything was slipping away. The darkness closed in, and his mind spiraled into the abyss. The figure loomed above him now, its face twisted in an expression of sorrow, rage, and something worse. Something that sent an icy shiver through his spine. "You can't run anymore," the voice whispered. "You never could." The ground beneath his feet crumbled. Ethan's knees buckled, and he fell, his face crashing into the cold, wet earth. The fog swirled above him like a storm, blotting out the light. The whispers grew louder, deafening now, until they were the only sound he could hear. And then, silence. Ethan lay there, gasping, his chest heaving with each breath. He had to get up. He had to run. But there was no more fight left in him. He had been running for so long, and now, at the edge of everything, there was nowhere left to go. A shadow loomed above him, and he looked up, his eyes wide with terror. The figure stood there watching him. And then the voice spoke one last time. You should never have come back. And then, darkness. Story 3. The wind howled, a cold, biting sound that carried with it the scent of something long forgotten. The sky above was choked with gray clouds, heavy with the promise of rain. It wasn't quite night yet, but the twilight had fallen in a way that felt like an omen. The world outside the car window seemed to be swallowing him whole, pulling him further into isolation with each mile. The road, winding and narrow, seemed to disappear into the darkness ahead, and the trees on either side loomed like dark sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Jack Thompson had never been afraid of the dark. In fact, he'd spent most of his life running toward it. But as he looked ahead, toward the isolated house on the hill, he couldn't help the uneasy knot that twisted in his stomach. The house, his destination, was still a good mile away, but it loomed large in his thoughts. It had always been there, in the back of his mind, a place he'd thought he'd never have to return to, a place he'd been trying to forget for years. But here he was on his way back. He glanced at the rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty, not a soul in sight. The headlights barely cut through the fog, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and stretch in unnatural ways. He tried to shake the unease from his mind, but it lingered. He'd driven this route a dozen times before, but it had never felt like this. Never felt like the world was conspiring to keep him out. The house had been abandoned for years, according to the locals. No one in the town would even speak its name. They'd always said it was cursed, that strange things had happened there long before Jack's time. And yet, as a boy, he'd been fascinated by it. The old house on the hill, hidden by thick trees and overgrown weeds, had been a thing of childhood stories. Stories told by his father about the family who once lived there, the ones who'd vanished without a trace. Jack shook his head. He didn't believe in curses. And he certainly didn't believe in ghosts. But something about the house made him uneasy. Maybe it was the fact that he hadn't set foot inside it since the accident. He slammed his hand against the steering wheel, frustrated with himself. It was just an old house. An old, forgotten house. No different than any other in the small town he'd grown up in. And yet, the closer he got, the more his pulse quickened, the more the tension in his chest built. As he crested the hill, the house finally came into view. It stood there as it always had, silent and watching. Its dark windows were like empty eyes staring back at him. The roof sagged and the wood was rotting, but it still held a presence, a weight that pressed down on the land around it. There was something about the way the fog clung to the house, as if it were trying to keep it hidden from the world. The house was old, decaying, but still, it seemed to be alive in some way. He parked the car at the edge of the dirt driveway and killed the engine. The silence that followed was oppressive, thick, almost suffocating. Jack sat in the car for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. He wasn't sure why he'd come. Maybe it was the need to confront the past, to understand why it still haunted him after all these years. Or maybe it was the loneliness that gnawed at him, the weight of his own memories that pulled him back to this place. He stepped out of the car, his boots sinking slightly into the wet earth. The air felt colder now, the mist thicker. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, his breath visible in the chill. With each step toward the house, the sense of unease deepened. It wasn't the house itself that bothered him. It was the feeling, the overwhelming sensation that something was watching him. Something was waiting for him. As he reached the front porch, Jack paused. The house loomed in front of him like a dark, hungry beast. The door, which had once been a welcoming entryway, now stood cracked open, the wood groaning in the wind. His heart raced in his chest, but he forced himself to take a step forward. Another. And then the door slammed shut. He froze. The sound was sharp, sudden, and echoing in the dead air around him. His breath caught in his throat. There had been no wind, no movement, nothing to explain the door's violent swing. He could hear his own heartbeat, pounding in his ears as the house stood silent again, as if nothing had happened. But Jack felt it, the weight of the silence. The house wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting. Jack pushed the door open. It creaked on its rusted hinges, the sound sending a chill down his spine. The entryway was dark, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper, the floorboards warped and cracked from years of neglect. He stepped inside, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of dust that covered everything. The smell hit him next, mold and mildew with a faint, almost sweet scent underneath, like something rotten. His hand brushed the wall, and he felt the cold dampness of the wood beneath the thin layer of peeling paint. The air inside was thick, oppressive, and still. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. But there was nothing. Just the silence, the weight of the past pressing in on him. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, he heard it. A whisper. A faint, distant voice. Jack. His name. It came from somewhere upstairs. Jack stood frozen at the foot of the stairs, his mind racing, heart pounding in his chest. The whisper had come from above, soft, faint, yet unmistakable. His name echoing through the silence of the old house. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it. It was just the wind. The house was old, creaky, and full of sounds that didn't make sense. He had to stop imagining things. After all, he wasn't a kid anymore. He was grown, a man with responsibilities. He had no time for childish fears. But still, the whisper clung to him like the cold air. Jack glanced up the stairs, but all he could see were shadows. The upper floor was cloaked in darkness, as if the house had swallowed the light itself. The stairs creaked under his weight as he ascended, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if the house was pushing back, reluctant to let him in. He paused at the top of the stairs, listening. Nothing. Just the soft drip of water somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of the wind outside rattling the windows. But there was something else, an odd pressure in the air, like the very atmosphere was thickening around him. A door at the end of the hallway caught his attention. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack he could just make out a faint glow, like the light of an old lamp left on. He felt drawn to it, compelled even, though every instinct in him screamed to turn around and leave. But Jack didn't leave. He walked down the narrow hallway, his footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The door seemed to beckon him forward, its faint glow flickering like a candle in the dark. As he reached out to push it open, the whisper came again. Jack. This time it was louder, more insistent. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He shoved the door open with a force that startled him, but there was no sudden movement, no jarring noise. The room beyond was empty, or so he thought. The light came from an old lamp, perched precariously on a dusty table, its bulb flickering as though struggling to stay on. The room itself was small, the walls lined with shelves filled with odd, forgotten trinkets. Everything was covered in dust, untouched by time. But it wasn't the room that caught his attention. It was the photo. A photograph sitting on the table next to the lamp. Jack didn't know why, but he couldn't look away from it. He picked it up with trembling hands, his heart skipping a beat. It was a family photo, old and worn, the edges frayed. There were 4 people in it, a man and a woman, both in their 30s, and 2 children. The children looked to be about 5 and 7, dressed in clothes that seemed strange to him, old-fashioned from another time. The unsettling part wasn't the photo itself, but the way it made him feel. The faces in the picture seemed familiar, though he couldn't place them. And the woman's smile, though warm, felt cold. Her eyes, they seemed to follow him even in the photo. Jack. The voice came again, this time from directly behind him. He whirled around, dropping the photo in the process. But there was nothing. Nothing but the empty room, the shadows stretching across the floor. His pulse quickened. He had to get out. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something else. Something new, something he hadn't seen before. A small, old-fashioned book lay open on the floor, its pages yellowed with age. Without thinking, he bent down to pick it up, his fingers grazing the brittle paper. The words on the page were faded, almost impossible to read, but something about the book made his skin crawl. It felt wrong, like it had been waiting for him. Waiting for someone to find it. As he opened it, a single word caught his eye, standing out from the faded ink. Whisper. He frowned, flipping through the pages. There were more words, but they didn't make sense. Scrambled letters. Symbols. A mix of languages he couldn't place. It was all gibberish, like the ramblings of a madman. But the word whispered kept appearing over and over again, like a chant. The pages seemed to hum in his hands, vibrating with a low, eerie resonance. A cold breeze swept through the room, sending a shiver down his spine. The lamp flickered again, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. He looked around, feeling the walls closing in on him. The sense of dread was overwhelming, like something was just beyond the edge of his vision, waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him. Jack jumped, his heart leaping in his chest. He rushed toward the door, trying the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. Panicking now, he backed away from the door, his mind racing. What was happening? Was he losing his mind? And then, through the thick silence, he heard it, the softest of sounds. A laugh. It was low, guttural, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. It sent a chill down his spine, a cold that seemed to settle deep within his bones. Jack. The voice was more than a whisper now. It was close, right behind him. He could feel the breath on his neck. Jack spun around, but there was no one there. The air in the room was thick, suffocating. The shadows seemed to reach out, crawling along the walls like living things, as if they had a life of their own. The temperature dropped and Jack could see his breath in the frigid air. He had to leave. No. But as he bolted for the window, his eyes caught something. Something on the wall, something he hadn't noticed before. A symbol scratched into the old wood. It was crude, twisted, like an ancient warning. And underneath it, written in fading ink, "You are not alone." Jack's heart thudded in his chest as he stood frozen in front of the window. The symbol on the wall burned into his mind, its twisted lines a cold reminder of how far from safe he was. He had to get out, but the sense of being trapped deepened with every breath. He turned back to the window, his hands shaking as he reached for the latch. The glass was cold, unyielding. It rattled slightly as he pulled at it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in, rising like a tidal wave, suffocating him. Behind him, the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching in unnatural ways, pooling around the edges of the walls. The low hum of the lamp had faded, replaced by a silence that felt alive, pressing in on him from all sides. A breath, soft and wet, brushed against the back of his neck. Jack whipped around, but there was no one there. Nothing but the thick darkness that had settled in the corners of the room. His pulse was pounding now, blood rushing in his ears, drowning out the sound of his own breathing. The window. That was his only way out. He turned back, his desperation rising, and yanked at the window again. This time, the glass cracked with a sharp, sickening sound, sending a spray of splinters across the room. But the window didn't open. He stumbled back, stumbling over the book and the scattered photograph. His heart pounded louder, each beat more frantic than the last. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, the air thickening with a weight he couldn't escape. And then something moved. A figure. A shadow, tall and impossibly thin, standing just beyond the edge of his vision. Its shape seemed to flicker, as if it wasn't fully part of the world, something pulled from the darkness itself. Jack blinked and the figure was gone. He wasn't sure if it had ever been there at all. His mind was playing tricks on him. The fear, the isolation, he was losing his grip. He had to get out. He needed air. Fresh, clean air. His hand reached for the door again. The door that had locked itself behind him. He gripped the knob with all his strength, trying to twist it, but it wouldn't move. The door felt like it was cemented shut. Then he heard it. The whisper. Jack. This time it came from everywhere. In the walls, in the air, in his mind. It was a voice that clawed at his sanity, dragging him toward the edge. It was close, too close, its presence suffocating. His breath hitched as the temperature in the room dropped even further. He could see his own breath now, swirling in the air like smoke. The darkness seemed to pulse, a living thing pressing in on him from all sides. A flicker of movement caught his eye. The hallway outside the room was darker than it should have been, even for the middle of the night. There, just outside the doorway, a pair of glowing eyes stared at him from the dark. Frozen, Jack's mouth went dry. The eyes were wide and unblinking, their yellowish hue sickly and unnatural. They were the eyes of something ancient, something that had seen too much. Something that shouldn't exist in this world. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. Jack wanted to scream, but the terror in his chest silenced him. His body felt like it was rooted to the spot, unable to flee. The shadows around the eyes grew thicker, twisting, turning like smoke from a fire, swirling around the doorway and curling toward him. Jack. It was the voice again, louder now, as if it were coming from the very walls. The eyes blinked, slowly. Then the figure stepped forward. It was a woman, her form distorted and half-shadowed, but the glow of her eyes burned through the darkness. Her face was pale, almost skeletal, with skin stretched tight over the bones of her skull. Her hair was long and tangled, hanging like a veil over her face, but Jack could still see her lips. They were curled into a smile, wide and jagged, as if the very act of smiling had broken her. She took a step forward. The air grew colder. The door behind Jack rattled violently, and the whispering grew louder, more frantic, like 100 voices speaking at once. The walls felt like they were closing in, the sound of creaking wood and grinding metal filling the room. The woman stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. And as she got closer, the shadows around her seemed to bend, swirling and shifting in unnatural patterns. Her smile widened even more, revealing teeth that were too long, too sharp. Jack backed away, his mind screaming at him to run, to do something, anything, but his body was frozen in place. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the woman's, could barely breathe beneath the weight of her presence. She wasn't just a woman. She was something else, something old and hungry. She raised a hand and Jack flinched. But she didn't touch him. Instead, she pointed behind him. Jack spun around. The room was different. The photo was gone. The book was gone. The lamp had shattered, its light snuffed out completely. And standing in the corner of the room against the far wall was the figure. The shadow. It was no longer flickering. It was solid, real, and it was coming toward him. Jack's heart slammed against his ribs as the figure in the corner of the room took a step forward. It was no longer a shadow, no longer something flickering in and out of existence. It was real, and it was coming toward him with a slow, deliberate pace that sent a chill down his spine. His legs refused to move, his body locked in terror. The air around him felt thick and oppressive, as though it were pressing down on him, suffocating him. He could barely breathe. The room was spinning, and the walls seemed to close in on him with each passing second. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long, the fingers too thin, too elongated. It walked with an eerie, jerky motion, its movements stiff as if the body didn't quite know how to function. Its face, if it could even be called that, was a blank canvas. There were no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretched over a hollow skull. Jack's throat went dry, and for a moment, it felt like he might faint, his vision tunneling as the figure drew nearer. He tried to back away, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. He couldn't escape. Not from this thing. Not from whatever this place had become. The air around him grew colder, the temperature plummeting so quickly that Jack could see his breath misting in the air. His mind raced, fighting to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. It was a nightmare, a hallucination. His eyes were playing tricks on him, they had to be. But the thing in the corner was still moving toward him. It stopped a few feet away, standing motionless now, as if waiting for something. Jack couldn't tear his eyes away from it, couldn't even blink. He was frozen, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The room seemed to grow darker. The shadows twisted and coiled, stretching long fingers toward him. There was a low, low sound now, almost like a hum, a vibration that seemed to pulse from the walls themselves. Jack could feel it in his chest, deep in his bones, making his skin crawl. And then he heard it. A voice. The voice that had been whispering his name. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear, sharp, like someone speaking directly into his ear. Jack, it said, but it wasn't the same voice he had heard before. This was different. This voice was deeper, older, more primal. It felt like it had been buried for centuries, clawing its way to the surface. The figure in the corner raised one long, bony arm, and Jack followed the movement with his eyes, unable to look away. The arm stretched unnaturally long, and the fingers seemed to twitch as though they had a mind of their own. And then something shifted in the air. A cold, wet breath, like a sigh, rippled across his face. He gasped, the air burning in his lungs as if the breath itself were alive, as if it had weight. He turned his head toward the doorway, his only possible escape, but it was blocked. The woman, the one with the glowing eyes, stood in the doorway now, her pale skin almost glowing in the dim light. Her smile was wider than before, as though it had become a grotesque mockery of a smile. "You can't leave, Jack," she said, her voice a low rasp that sent a chill crawling down his spine. "You're already here." Her words were thick with a terrible kind of certainty, as though she had known this moment would come long before he had even arrived at the house. And that thought sent another spike of fear through his chest. "Get away from me," he managed to gasp, though his voice sounded foreign in his own ears. It wasn't his voice. It was weak, trembling, a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else. But the woman didn't move. She just stood there, watching him with her unblinking eyes, her lips still twisted in that unnerving smile. Jack's mind was a whirlwind of terror, but he fought to hold on to his thoughts. He couldn't lose himself completely. Not now. He tore his eyes away from her, back to the figure in the corner. It was still standing there, motionless, waiting, and then it moved again. It wasn't like a human movement. It was unnatural, jerky, like a puppet on broken strings. It reached out, its long fingers stretching toward Jack's throat. He gasped, stepping back instinctively, but he wasn't fast enough. The thing's hand, cold, clammy, and impossibly long, grabbed him by the wrist, its grip like iron. Pain shot through him as its fingers dug into his flesh. He tried to pull away, but the thing's grip tightened, its long nails pressing into his skin, drawing blood. The room spun, his head dizzy, as the creature's other hand reached up, brushing against his cheek with a cold, wet touch. His pulse thundered in his ears, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Jack," the voice whispered again. The same voice. But now it was everywhere, surrounding him, filling his mind, drowning him in its pressure. "You are never leaving." He twisted his wrist in a desperate attempt to break free, but the creature's hold was unrelenting. It tugged him forward, slowly, deliberately, pulling him toward the darkness at the far end of the room, toward the black void that seemed to open up like a mouth, waiting to swallow him whole. "Please," Jack managed to croak, his voice barely audible over the deafening hum in his ears. "Please, no." But the figure didn't answer. It didn't need to. Its actions spoke louder than any words ever could. The shadows behind the creature thickened, becoming more tangible, more alive. It was like the very room itself was pulling him in, and he could feel the walls closing in on him. The darkness seemed to wrap around him, crushing him, until all he could see were those terrible eyes, those hollow, glowing eyes, burning through him. With a final, sickening yank, the creature dragged him forward, and the room went black. The darkness was absolute. Jack's chest heaved with shallow, frantic breaths as the weight of the room pressed down on him. He was no longer standing, no longer aware of the ground beneath him. It felt as if the very air around him had solidified, pushing him down, trapping him in an endless void. The silence was deafening. The kind of silence that made his skin crawl, a silence that wasn't natural. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the sound of something waiting, watching, listening. A cold, clammy sensation spread across his body, his skin prickling as though he were being touched by unseen hands. He could feel the presence around him, moving in the shadows, circling him, pulling at him. His throat tightened as if the air itself had grown thicker, harder to swallow. And then a sound. A low, guttural whisper, so close it seemed to come from inside his own head. "Jack." The voice was deeper now, no longer the soft murmur he had heard before. It was heavy with malice, reverberating through his skull, as if it were trying to claw its way into his very thoughts. He gasped, stumbling backward, his hands reaching out in the darkness, searching for something, anything, that might ground him. His fingers brushed against the rough surface of the walls. Cold stone, damp and slick, the texture biting into his skin as he pressed against it, trying to make sense of the overwhelming pressure on his chest. Suddenly the air shifted. A faint flicker of light, too faint to truly be seen, stirred the shadows around him. Jack's heart raced in his chest as his eyes strained to see through the thick blackness. Something was moving toward him. Something with purpose. Then a flash of white, a glint of pale skin, a pair of eyes, cut through the darkness. It was the woman. The one with the glowing eyes. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to cry out, but the sound stuck in his throat, choked by the fear that surged through him. "Please?" He whispered, his voice barely a sound in the suffocating silence. "What do you want from me?" Her smile was the first thing he saw. A grotesque, wide stretch of lips that seemed to split her face in two. It was inhuman, and yet it was all too real. The smile grew, twisting and stretching impossibly, as if it would swallow her entire face. "You," she said, her voice a terrible whisper that filled the room. "You are the key." The word sent a shock through Jack's body, freezing him in place. The key? To what? What was she talking about? Her figure loomed closer, and as she stepped forward, the shadows around her seemed to pulse, like the very air was alive, feeding off her presence. Her eyes, glowing like twin orbs of sickly yellow, bore into him, the intensity of her gaze burning him from the inside out. Jack couldn't look away. He couldn't blink. Every inch of him screamed to escape, but he was rooted in place, as if the darkness itself had locked him down. "You are here," she continued, her smile widening, "because the house remembers you." Jack's mind spun. The house remembered him? He had never been here before. He had never even heard of this place. How could it remember him? His body felt heavy, as if the walls were pushing against him, pulling him into the depths of the house. He tried to move, tried to run, but his legs were like stone, his arms frozen at his sides. His mind was screaming at him, telling him to fight, to get out, but his body didn't respond. It was as if the house had claimed him, as if it had taken hold of his very soul. "Why?" Jack managed to choke out, his voice weak, trembling. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took another step forward, until they were mere inches apart. Her breath was cold, like ice against his skin, and the stench of decay lingered in the air around her. She leaned in close, her face inches from his. Her lips parted, and Jack's breath caught in his throat as he saw something move in her mouth. Not teeth, no, not teeth. Something worse. Something that was writhing, twisting like 100 tiny things scrambling to get out. "You should have never come here," she hissed, her voice low and dripping with venom. "Now you belong to us." With that, she raised her hand, her long, bony fingers curling into a claw, and Jack's body reacted before his mind could. He wanted to push her away, but his hands were weak, like they no longer belonged to him. She took hold of his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh like iron. "Stop!" Jack gasped, but his voice was drowned out by the oppressive hum that filled the air around him. The walls seemed to be closing in, the darkness pressing closer with each passing second. He was suffocating. The shadows in the room seemed to grow, stretching and twisting as if they were alive, pulling at his limbs, dragging him down into the floor. He struggled, but it was no use. The house had him. The woman had him. The darkness was swallowing him whole. And then, just as he thought he would be consumed by the black void, the lights flickered. The room went from black to a sickly green, and for a moment, Jack thought he saw something else, something out of place. A doorway in the corner, half hidden by shadows. Without thinking, Jack lunged toward it, fighting against the pull of the darkness. He wasn't sure what he was running toward, but it was the only chance he had. He ran as fast as he could, his legs shaking beneath him, but the house wasn't done with him. The woman's laugh echoed in his ears, mocking him, taunting him as he stumbled toward the doorway. "You can't escape," she whispered, her voice colder than the air around him. But Jack wasn't listening anymore. He ran faster, harder, the doorway getting closer. His chest burned, his lungs screaming for air. The woman was right behind him. And then, just as he reached the doorway, everything went black. Jack's eyes snapped open and he gasped for air, his body trembling from the lingering fear. He was no longer in the suffocating darkness. Instead, he was lying on cold stone, his face pressed against the floor, the musty smell of old wood and dampness filling his nostrils. The air was thick and heavy, but there was no sound, nothing but the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady as if they weren't his own. His head spun with confusion, and for a moment he wasn't sure where he was. The door? He had almost reached the door, hadn't he? He looked around, disoriented. The room he was in now was different. The stone walls were cracked and worn, covered in grime and mold, and the faintest glimmer of light flickered from somewhere far above, casting eerie shadows that danced across the room like living things. Jack's breath hitched. He was in a basement. It was colder here, the air mustier and heavier. The faint scent of decay lingered, mixing with the dampness in the air. Something wasn't right. His body screamed to leave, but his legs refused to move. The house had him in its grip now, he could feel it, the oppressive weight of it pressing down on him. The walls felt alive, breathing in time with his own ragged breaths. Suddenly, a voice echoed in the silence. "You shouldn't be here." Jack froze, his blood running cold. He spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one in sight. His heart slammed against his chest as the voice spoke again, this time louder, more distinct. "You've come too far." It was a woman's voice, soft, but heavy with an unmistakable sense of foreboding. He stumbled backward, his mind reeling. The voice, it sounded so familiar. But how could it? No one else was here, was there? He strained his ears, listening, trying to make sense of the whispers. They didn't seem to be coming from any one place. They were all around him, in the walls, in the very air he breathed. "You're not supposed to remember," the voice continued, its tone now tinged with sorrow. "The house will take what it needs." Jack's chest tightened. The words, they felt like they were meant for him, meant to wake something deep inside of him. His past, it was all coming back, but in flashes, fragments that he couldn't quite grasp. The whisper continued, now barely audible, as though it was fading. "Don't let it." Jack's eyes darted around the room, panic flooding his veins. He could feel the presence of something watching him from the shadows. The house, the woman, there was something he didn't understand. The walls pressed closer, the floor creaking underfoot as if the house itself were alive, breathing in the very air he breathed. A sudden flash of light from the corner of his eye caught his attention. He turned sharply, his heart racing. A shape, a silhouette, stood near the far wall, just beyond the range of the dim light. It was a figure, but it wasn't human. Not entirely. The shape was long and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its posture twisted and wrong. It was crouched, its head hanging low, as if it was studying him with a predatory gaze. Jack's body froze, his breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, but the words wouldn't come. He could feel the presence of something ancient, something powerful in the room with him. The figure's head snapped up, and Jack's blood ran cold as he locked eyes with it. There was nothing human in those eyes. No warmth, no compassion. Just an endless void. Then it spoke, its voice like the grinding of stone. Too late. The air around Jack seemed to warp, the room twisting and shifting as if the very walls were bending, warping in response to the figure's presence. The shadows in the corners of the room writhed, coming to life like a mass of serpents, slithering toward him. Jack took a step back, his foot hitting something cold and metallic. He looked down and saw an old, rusted chain wrapped around a pillar in the center of the room, the links worn from age and use. He didn't have time to think. Panic surged through him as the chains rattled, the sound sharp and jarring, cutting through the silence like a blade. Something was coming closer, something far worse than the figure before him. He looked back at the creature, but it was gone. It had melted into the shadows, leaving only the sensation of its presence lingering in the room like a foul odor. And then the whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. "You remember?" The walls trembled, the chains rattled more violently, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. Jack's vision blurred as the whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their words indistinguishable but full of desperation and hunger. "You're not safe," they chanted in unison, the words slithering into his mind. Jack stumbled backward, desperate to escape, but there was no way out. The walls were closing in. The shadows were suffocating him. The chains rattled louder, their violent rhythm matching the pounding of his heart. His breath caught as something shifted in the darkness, something moving toward him. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the deafening chorus of whispers. He tried to move, but his legs refused to cooperate. A cold hand clamped around his wrist, pulling him toward the center of the room. Jack's eyes went wide as he looked down. There was nothing there, nothing visible. But he could feel it, a terrible presence, cold and unyielding, pulling him closer, tightening its grip. The darkness swirled around him, and he was swallowed by it. Jack's vision cleared slowly, but it felt as though he was waking from a dream, or a nightmare that was far too real. His breath came in shallow gasps, his body still trembling from the violent pull of the unseen force. The cold hand that had gripped his wrist now seemed to linger in his memory, a phantom touch that sent chills crawling down his spine. He looked around, his heart racing. He was back in the basement, the stone walls pressing in on him like a suffocating tomb. The shadows had shifted, become darker, more tangible. He could almost feel them, wrapping around his legs like cold tendrils, trying to pull him back into the blackness. The chains still rattled, their hollow clinks echoing through the room, but now they sounded more like whispers, like laughter. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice whispered from the shadows. Jack's pulse spiked. He spun around, his eyes wide with fear, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the dilapidated furniture and the ominous chain in the center. He stumbled to his feet, his legs weak and unsteady. Every muscle screamed in protest, but he ignored it. He had to get out. He had to. A low creak echoed from behind him. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Standing in the doorway, framed by the faintest sliver of light from the upper floor, was a figure. It was a woman, her face obscured by the hood of her long, tattered cloak. Her features were hidden in the shadows, but there was something about her, something that made his blood run cold. She stood still, motionless, as if waiting for him to make the first move. The room seemed to grow even colder, the temperature dropping by degrees, until Jack could see his breath fogging in the air. "You can't escape," the woman said softly, her voice distant but unmistakably clear. "It will always find you." Jack's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He stepped backward toward the stone walls as if he could somehow escape her gaze. His mind screamed at him to run, to flee, but his legs felt like lead. The woman's voice echoed in his ears, a constant whisper, pressing on his mind like a weight. "It's too late," she continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "You belong to the house now. You were always meant to be here." The air seemed to thicken, the shadows around her growing longer, stretching like dark arms reaching for him. Jack's breath came faster, panic overtaking him. The ground beneath him trembled slightly, and he looked down to see the dust stirring, as though something was moving underneath the floorboards. The woman took a step forward, her cloak rustling softly, and Jack froze. Her hood shifted slightly, revealing a pale face, but it was contorted, twisted. Her eyes were black pits, empty and hollow, sucking in the light around them. Her lips moved in a slow, deliberate motion, forming words that didn't make sense, but they were words that resonated deep within his chest. "It has always been you." Jack opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat felt dry, constricted, as though the very air was choking him. He tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as if the house itself had grown roots into his legs, holding him in place. The woman's face twisted in an expression that could have been a smile, but it was more like a grimace. "You don't remember, do you? You don't remember what you did?" The words hit him like a blow to the chest. What did she mean? What had he done? His mind raced, desperately searching for answers, but all he found was emptiness. There was a void where his memory should have been, and it felt like he was being swallowed by it inch by inch. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness washed over him, and he staggered, barely able to keep himself upright. The room seemed to shift around him, the walls warping and bending like rubber. The shadows stretched, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to close in on him, suffocating him with their darkness. The woman stepped closer, her presence growing stronger with every step. The air grew colder still until Jack could feel the chill biting into his skin. He wanted to scream, to fight, but his voice was trapped, silenced by the weight of the house's oppressive grip. "It's time to remember," she said, her voice now a low, guttural whisper, as though it was coming from far away. "Everything you've forgotten, it's all here. All of it. You're not just a visitor. You never were." Jack's chest tightened, his mind whirling. The house. The past. What was she talking about? He had no answers, no clarity, only the crushing weight of her words pressing down on him. The floor beneath him groaned, and a crack split the stone, snaking its way across the room. The darkness seemed to grow, reaching out with tendrils that wrapped around his body, pulling him toward the center of the room. He tried to resist, but the pull was too strong. "Remember." The woman's voice became a command, a chant, a mantra that reverberated in his skull. He fought against it, struggling to break free, but the shadows were everywhere now, drowning him, consuming him. His mind flashed with fragmented images, faces, places, things he couldn't quite grasp. There was a moment, he remembered it now, a moment from his childhood. He was running through a forest, the trees looming like dark sentinels around him. A voice, his mother's voice, calling for him to come back. But he didn't go. He couldn't. The shadows closed in around him, and the woman's face was the last thing he saw before everything went dark. The first thing Jack became aware of was the cold. It was seeping into his bones, chilling him to the core, but there was something else too. A weight pressing down on his chest, a suffocating presence that made it hard to breathe. His body was still, unmoving, as though it had been trapped in some sort of stasis. His mind struggled to regain focus, but everything felt distant, like he was drifting between waking and dreaming. He opened his eyes, blinking against the darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. His vision was blurry at first, but it soon sharpened, and he realized he was lying on the floor, the cold stone beneath him like ice against his skin. The room was eerily silent, save for the faint, irregular sound of breathing, his own, shallow and quick. He tried to sit up, but his body felt heavy as though it were made of lead. His head throbbed, the pain a dull ache behind his eyes, and his thoughts felt disjointed. Where was he? What was happening? The last thing he remembered, the woman, the voice, the shadows. The darkness in the room was thick, but there was a faint light coming from somewhere ahead of him. He squinted, trying to make sense of the shapes that surrounded him. As his eyes adjusted, he saw what appeared to be a mirror, standing against the far wall, its surface cracked and fractured. The faint light seemed to be coming from the shards of glass, which reflected the room in twisted, jagged angles. Jack pushed himself to his feet, using the wall for support. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he steadied himself, determined to move forward. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening, what had happened. As he walked toward the mirror, the air seemed to grow heavier with every step. The shadows pressed in closer, curling around his ankles like ghostly fingers. He didn't look down. He couldn't. His gaze was fixed on the mirror, on the fractured reflection staring back at him. When he reached it, he hesitated. The glass was dark and distorted, but it still reflected his image, or what should have been his image. The face staring back at him was familiar, but it was wrong. The features were twisted, stretched, as though the reflection was a distorted version of himself, a ghostly mockery. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the surface of the glass. The moment his fingers made contact, the room seemed to shift. The shadows recoiled, and the air grew colder still. He jerked his hand back, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but something had changed. The mirror, the cracks in the glass seemed to pulse, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. A voice, soft and distant, whispered from the depths of the shattered mirror. "Look." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice. It was hers, the woman who had been haunting him, tormenting him with her cryptic words. He had to look. He had to see what was in the mirror. He didn't want to, but something inside him, something deep and primal, urged him forward. He had to know. He had to understand. He stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat, and stared at the reflection. The image of his own face was still there, but it had changed. His eyes were dark, hollow, as though something had taken root inside of him. Something twisted, something ancient. The reflection smiled, but it wasn't his smile. was wrong. You remember, the voice said again, but this time it was louder, more insistent. You can't escape what you are. Jack recoiled, his stomach lurching as the words sank in. What did it mean? What was he? The reflection's smile widened, its lips curling into a grotesque grin, as if mocking him, daring him to understand. The shards of glass seemed to shimmer, and for a split second, Jack thought he saw something else. Something moving behind him, a shadow lurking at the edge of his vision. He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest, but there was nothing there. Just the same cold, empty room. But the mirror was different now. The shards had moved. The reflections had shifted, showing glimpses of places he didn't recognize. Dark forests, abandoned houses, faces that he couldn't quite place but felt strangely familiar. His head spun, his mind reeling with the images, the sounds, the whispers. And then, in the corner of the mirror, something else appeared. A figure. A shadow, flickering in and out of view like a flickering candle in the wind. Jack's heart raced as he tried to focus on it. It was a person, but not quite. The figure was tall, thin, its face hidden in shadow. Its hands were long, too long, with fingers that stretched and twitched like something out of a nightmare. The figure reached out toward him, its hands moving through the mirror as though it was trying to grab him. Jack's breath hitched in his throat, and he stumbled backward, panic flooding his veins. You can't escape, the voice said again, louder now, more insistent, its tone shifting from a whisper to something colder, darker. It's already too late. You've always been here. Jack's mind screamed for him to run, to get away from the mirror, but his feet wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his body frozen by a force he couldn't understand. The figure in the mirror stretched its hand toward him, its fingers now inches from his face. Jack's heart slammed in his chest, his body shaking with terror. He tried to scream, but the words died in his throat. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows closing in around him, suffocating him. The figure in the mirror reached out further, its cold fingers brushing against his skin. And then, with a violent crack, the mirror shattered. Glass exploded in all directions, the shards falling like rain, but Jack didn't feel the sting of the shards cutting into his skin. The darkness that had been pressing in on him seemed to swallow the room whole, leaving him standing in an abyss of nothingness. For a moment, everything was still. No sound, no movement, just the weight of the silence pressing in on him, the suffocating darkness enveloping him like a shroud. And then, from the deep, came a voice. A low, guttural growl. You should have never come back. The house was quieter than ever, the stillness almost suffocating. Jack had no idea how long he had been standing in the dark, his body numb and his mind spinning in a chaotic whirlwind of confusion and dread. The mirror had shattered, but the feeling of its cold, malevolent presence lingered in the air. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest tight with fear. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the house anymore, it was him. He glanced around, trying to make sense of his surroundings, but the darkness seemed to swallow everything. The walls, once imposing, now felt like they were closing in on him, their jagged edges reaching out like hands, ready to pull him under. His heart hammered in his chest as his eyes darted about, searching for some sign of life, some clue that could explain what was happening. There was nothing. Just the oppressive silence and the distant, faint sound of his own heartbeat. Hello? His voice trembled as he called into the void, the word lost in the vast emptiness of the house. No response. He shook his head, pushing forward despite the overwhelming fear that gripped him. The house was more than just a structure. It was a living thing, pulsating with an energy that felt ancient, cruel. His steps echoed as he moved down the narrow hallway, the wooden floors creaking beneath him with each footfall. He tried to focus on his breathing, tried to ignore the panic that was creeping up his spine, but it was no use. Something was coming. He wasn't alone. Jack's eyes caught a flash of movement in the corner of the hallway, a fleeting shadow darting across the floor. His heart leapt into his throat as he turned quickly, his body instinctively bracing for whatever was there. But again there was nothing. Just the same dimly lit hallway and the same oppressive silence. But then the voice came again, clear and cold, as though it was right behind him. You can't run from yourself. Jack whipped around, his muscles tensing, but there was no one there. His skin crawled as the voice lingered, echoing in his mind, reverberating off the walls. He was losing his mind. He had to be. The house, the mirror, the shadows, they were all blending together into a blur of terror and confusion. He had to get out. He had to leave before it consumed him completely. But as he turned to move, something caught his eye, a figure standing at the far end of the hallway. A man tall and thin, dressed in tattered clothes that hung from his emaciated frame. His face was hidden in shadow, but Jack could feel his eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, staring at him with an intensity that pierced through him like a blade. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his presence so oppressive that Jack could barely breathe. The air seemed to thicken around him, the darkness pressing in, squeezing the life out of the space. Jack's feet felt like they were rooted to the floor, unable to move, as if the very sight of the man was holding him captive. And then, the voice again. "He's waiting for you." Jack's pulse raced as his instincts screamed at him to run. But something was stopping him, some force, some presence that seemed to be keeping him in place. He couldn't break free. The figure in the shadows shifted slightly, its head tilting in a slow, deliberate motion. Jack's throat tightened as the figure took a step forward, the sound of its footsteps barely audible but somehow deafening in the stillness of the hallway. The man's face remained hidden, but Jack could feel the weight of his gaze, the pressure of those hollow eyes piercing through him, seeing something in him, something that made his skin crawl. "What do you want?" Jack finally managed to rasp, his voice barely above a whisper. His throat was dry, his breath shallow, but he had to ask. He had to understand. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took another step forward, and Jack felt a chill run through his body. The air around him seemed to drop in temperature, as if the very essence of the house was freezing him from the inside out. He tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't obey. He was trapped. Every step forward the figure took seemed to push him further into the depths of the house, deeper into the heart of whatever nightmare was unfolding. "Help me," Jack pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation, but the figure did not speak. It merely advanced, its hollow eyes never leaving his face, its gaze boring into him like a physical force. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled against the invisible pull that was holding him in place. But then, just as the figure was within arm's reach, it stopped. It tilted its head again, the movement slow and deliberate, as if considering something. And then, in a voice that was so faint Jack could barely hear it, the figure spoke. "You don't need help. You need to remember." The words cut through him like a knife, sending a chill through his entire body. Jack's mind reeled. Remember what? What was he forgetting? What was he running from? The figure stepped forward once again, its hollow eyes locked onto his, its gaze now sharp and intense. Jack could feel his legs trembling beneath him, but still he could not move. And then a horrifying realization struck him. This wasn't just some figure, some ghost haunting the house. This was him. This was a part of him. A dark part of himself that he had buried long ago. I don't understand," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible as he struggled to hold onto the fragments of his sanity. But the figure didn't respond. It simply reached out, its hand extending toward him, the long bony fingers stretching impossibly far. Jack's breath hitched in his throat as the fingers closed around his wrist, the cold touch seeping into his skin, freezing him from the inside out. The house seemed to tremble, the walls vibrating as though something ancient and powerful was awakening. And then, with a sickening lurch, the figure whispered in his ear, its voice now a low, guttural hiss. "Remember?" Jack's mind was in a whirlwind. The figure's touch, the chill of its fingers wrapping around his wrist, was seared into his skin like ice. His body trembled, but his mind was far worse. The voice that whispered remembered still echoed in his ears, sending waves of confusion and dread through him. The walls of the house seemed to bend and sway as if the very building was alive, alive with a terrible hunger. For a moment he thought he might pass out. His legs buckled beneath him and he collapsed to the ground. His chest heaved, each breath shallow and ragged as though he were trying to inhale air from some poisoned well. He looked down at his hand, still feeling the cold burn of the figure's touch. But there was nothing there. No bruises. No marks. Nothing. Yet it still felt like a part of him was missing, a piece of himself that had been stolen away. He pushed himself off the floor, stumbling backward toward the door. His mind screamed at him to leave, to get out of this house that had become a prison, a labyrinth of fear and confusion. But every step he took only felt like it led him deeper into the nightmare. The silence in the house was deafening. The air, thick with an almost suffocating stillness, pressed against his chest. He could hear nothing, no wind, no birds, no movement beyond the walls of the house. Only the oppressive quiet of something waiting, something watching. The door slammed shut with a force that made Jack jump. His heart pounded in his chest, but his feet didn't move. He couldn't leave. Not yet. A sound broke the silence, low and soft at first, like a whisper caught in the wind. But it grew louder, the sound of something dragging across the floor, slow, deliberate, and dragging its weight in the dark. Jack's breath caught in his throat as his eyes darted to the hallway. He couldn't see anything, only the shadows stretching long and sinister in the dim light. Then, from the corner of his vision, he saw it. A figure crawling toward him. The thing's movements were unnatural, jerky, like it was still learning how to move in its broken form. It scraped along the floor with its fingers that were bent at impossible angles, nails sharp and jagged. Its body was twisted, its limbs misshapen, as if the bones had been broken and reset in the wrong places. Jack's stomach churned at the sight. He wanted to scream, but the air was thick in his throat. The thing's head jerked upward and Jack froze. Its eyes, those empty, soulless pits, stared directly at him, its gaze burning into his skull. There was no face, no features, just an endless, hollow darkness, like staring into the void. The figure's mouth opened, wide and unnatural, and Jack could hear the softest of whispers, like 1,000 voices layered together, each one speaking in a language he couldn't understand. But there was one word that cut through it all. Remember. Jack's breath hitched, his heart racing. He couldn't take his eyes off the thing. His entire body screamed to run, but his feet were stuck to the floor, frozen by fear. The creature moved closer, its limbs scraping along the floor as it crawled toward him with unnatural speed. Each movement was accompanied by a sickening crack, the sound of bones shifting and grinding, as though it was struggling to hold itself together. The air seemed to grow colder as it neared, a chill so deep it felt like it was coming from within his own bones. Jack could feel his teeth chattering as his body trembled uncontrollably. His legs, weak with fear, buckled again and he fell to his knees. His vision blurred as the thing came closer, its twisted form filling the room. And then, just as the thing reached out toward him, the whisper stopped. A voice, familiar and soft, cut through the silence. A voice he had heard many times before. Jack. He blinked, his eyes struggling to focus through the haze of terror. It was his mother's voice, soft and comforting, like it had been years ago, when she had tucked him in at night. She hadn't spoken to him like this in years, not since that night. His hands clenched into fists as memories flooded his mind, memories he had buried deep, memories he didn't want to face. Jack, you have to remember. It's all connected. You know it is. His head spun, trying to grasp the fragments of the past that had eluded him for so long. The house, the figure, the creature. Everything felt so wrong, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. His mind was unraveling, each thread pulling him deeper into the blackness. And yet, somewhere in the depths of his fear, he could hear her, his mother, guiding him, warning him. Remember, Jack? He shook his head, trying to force the voice out of his mind. But it wasn't just her voice, it was the house too. The walls seemed to close in around him, pressing in on him with an unbearable weight. The shadows grew longer, more oppressive. His breath came in short gasps as his body began to feel heavy, like the house was pulling him under, drowning him in its darkness. And then, suddenly, everything went quiet. For a moment, Jack thought he might be free, that maybe the nightmare had finally come to an end. But as his heart slowed and his mind cleared, he realized something horrifying. The creature had stopped moving. It was standing behind him now, its cold breath brushing against his neck, its twisted fingers brushing his shoulder like a caress. He didn't dare turn around, knowing what he would see. But the thing didn't move. Remember, it whispered again, and the voice was no longer his mother's. It was his own. Jack's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. The thing wasn't just some monster, it was a part of him. A part of his past that he had buried so deep he didn't even recognize it. And now it was coming to take him, to drag him back into the darkness he had tried so hard to forget. As his world began to close in around him, he felt the thing's fingers press into his skin, the cold seeping into his bones. The darkness swallowed him whole. The air was thick, suffocating, and Jack could feel his breath coming in ragged gasps. His lungs burned, but it wasn't just from the terror that had gripped him. It was the weight of the darkness itself, the heaviness of all the fear and guilt he had been carrying for so long. He was no longer sure where he was. It wasn't the house anymore. It wasn't the forest. It was as if the very fabric of reality had unraveled, and he was trapped in the place between places, a realm of shadows, echoes, and broken memories. He could feel the creature's presence around him, its terrible form lurking just beyond his sight. The air was alive with its malice. He could hear its claws scraping against the floor, the low growls that vibrated in his chest. It wasn't just hunting him now. It was toying with him, savoring the fear that radiated off him. "You can't hide from me," the creature hissed, its voice a blend of everything Jack feared. His father's condemnation, his mother's sorrow, and the deep, guttural growl of the entity itself. "You were always meant to be here. To face the truth." Jack stumbled backward, his feet slipping on the wet floor, but there was nowhere to run. The darkness surrounded him, pressing in from all sides, suffocating, consuming. The floor, now slick with something viscous, seemed to shift beneath him like quicksand. The shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They were alive. "Face me, Jack. Face your guilt," the creature crooned. The words cut deep, but Jack refused to let it control him any longer. He had been running from this his entire life, from the fear of his father's disappointment, from the guilt that haunted him, from the darkness in his own soul. But this was the end. He couldn't run anymore. It had all led to this moment. And in the face of this entity, in the face of his own fear, he realized something. It wasn't the creature that haunted him. It was himself. Jack straightened up, his body trembling, but his resolve firming with every breath. The shadows that had once been so overwhelming now felt like they could be challenged. He didn't know how, but he couldn't give in. Not this time. "I'm not you," Jack said, his voice shaky but louder now. "I won't let you control me anymore." The air crackled, the tension thickening to a breaking point, and for the briefest moment, Jack saw it, the creature's true form. It wasn't the monstrous shape he had imagined. It was a reflection of him, his own fear, his own regret, his own guilt, twisted and magnified into something unrecognizable. The creature's eyes were his eyes, staring back at him with the same judgment, the same emptiness. It was everything he had ever feared in himself. But he understood now. The creature was a manifestation of his own weakness, his own failure to confront the past. It wasn't something external. It was him. It had always been him. And with that realization, something inside Jack shifted. The darkness that had suffocated him for so long seemed to waver, its hold on him loosening just for a moment. Jack took a step forward, the shadows retreating ever so slightly. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was something else, something like strength. "Leave me," Jack whispered, but this time there was no hesitation in his voice. "You're not real. You're just a part of me, and I'm done with you." The creature let out a sound, a mix of rage and despair, as if it understood what Jack was saying, as if it knew its grip on him was slipping. But it wasn't enough. The creature lunged at him, faster than he could react, its claws slashing through the air. Jack didn't move. He stood his ground, facing the darkness head-on. And then, in that final moment, Jack understood. The entity was nothing more than a reflection of his fear. It had no power over him, not anymore. It had never had power. All along, it had been his own terror that had fueled it, his own guilt and self-doubt. With one final, defiant breath, Jack stepped forward into the creature's embrace. And in that instant, the darkness shattered. The shadows that had closed in around him crumbled like dust, fading away as if they were never real to begin with. The creature screamed, a sound that rattled the walls of the universe, but it was a fading echo. It couldn't survive without the fear that had sustained it. And as Jack stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, he knew that he had defeated it, not with force but with the acceptance of his own flaws, his own humanity. The world around him began to shift, the darkness retreating, the oppressive air lifting. He was no longer trapped. The house, the forest, the night, they were all gone. Everything was gone. Jack looked around, his breath steadying, the weight of the past finally lifting from his shoulders. He was free. But as he stood in the stillness, staring into the empty space where the darkness had been, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. That somehow, somewhere, the fear still lingered, waiting for the right moment to return. And as Jack turned to leave, he saw something in the distance, just a flicker at the edge of his vision, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. But he didn't turn back. Not this time.